Imagine a sun-drenched villa by the Mediterranean, where laughter hides a deadly secret. When wealthy widow Evelyn Hartley drowns on a boat trip, it seems a tragic accident, until Miss Jane Marple, the unassuming sleuth, uncovers a chilling plot. The body isn't Evelyn's, but a murdered stranger dressed to deceive. Her companion, Clara Vane, harbours a dark past, a forged letter, and a desperate plan to steal a fortune. As the missing will unravels and Evelyn is found alive, Marple's keen eye exposes greed, betrayal, and murder. In just 30 seconds, dive into a mystery where trust is a trap and truth is the only escape. Chapter 1: The Villa by the Sea. The late afternoon sun hung low over the jagged cliffs of St. Antoine, painting the Mediterranean in hues of amber and rose. From the veranda of the Villa Aurora, Miss Jane Marple gazed out at the shimmering sea, her frail hands folded neatly over a pale blue shawl. The air was warm, scented with lavender and salt, but a faint chill lingered in her bones, a reminder of the bronchitis that had sent her here, to this quiet French resort, on her doctor's stern advice. "Rest, Jane," he'd said, "and no village intrigues." She'd smiled then, as she did now, knowing life had a way of ignoring such prescriptions. The Villa Aurora, a charming sprawl of whitewashed walls and terracotta tiles, belonged to her old friend Dolly Bantry, who'd let it this summer to a small eclectic party. Miss Marple, invited as a guest, had arrived 2 days prior, her modest suitcase unpacked in a room overlooking the olive groves. She'd already taken the measure of her companions, as was her habit, with the same unassuming scrutiny she applied to the parishioners of St. Mary Mead. There was Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, a widow from Devon, whose hearty laugh and florid cheeks suggested a woman accustomed to comfort. Her fortune, inherited from a late husband in shipping, was evident in her sapphire earrings and the careless way she spoke of her travels. She was, Miss Marple thought, the sort who trusted easily, perhaps too easily. Then there was Miss Clara Vane, Mrs. Hartley's companion, a woman of about 35 with a pinched face and eyes that seemed to flinch from direct gazes. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back, and her movements were precise, like a clock wound too tight. She spoke little, but when she did, her voice was low, with a trace of something Miss Marple couldn't quite place. Nervousness, perhaps, or calculation. The party was completed by Dr. Richard Lloyd and his wife, Margaret. Dr. Lloyd, a lean man with a brisk manner and wire-rimmed spectacles, had the air of a scientist more at home with test tubes than people. His wife, a delicate creature with wide, anxious eyes and a habit of twisting her wedding ring, seemed perpetually on edge, as if expecting bad news. They were newlyweds, Mrs. Hartley had confided, though their affection seemed strained, like a tune played slightly off-key. Miss Marple, seated in a wicker chair with her knitting, observed them now as they gathered for pre-dinner drinks. The douche veranda was bathed in the soft glow of lanterns, and a breeze stirred the bougainvillea climbing the walls. Mrs. Hartley, in a flowing dress of emerald silk, was holding court, her voice carrying over the clink of glasses. "Tomorrow we must take the boat out," she declared, gesturing toward the sea. "There's a cove Clara found in the guidebook, perfect for a picnic. Clara, you'll come, won't you?" Miss Vane, standing slightly apart, clutched a glass of lemonade. "Of course, Evelyn," she said. her lips curving into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It sounds lovely." Her tone was polite, but Miss Marple noted the slight tightening of her fingers, the way her gaze flicked toward the darkening horizon. Dr. Lloyd, polishing his glasses, nodded absently. "Fine idea, provided the weather holds. Currents can be tricky here." His wife, perched on the edge of a chair, murmured agreement, her eyes darting to her husband as if seeking approval. Miss Marple's needles clicked rhythmically, a soft counterpoint to the conversation. She said nothing, but her mind was busy. There was something in Miss Vane's manner, a guardedness, a watchfulness, that reminded her of Ellen, a housemaid in St. Mary Mead, who'd once stolen silver to pay a debt. Ellen's eyes had held that same wary glint, as if she expected discovery at any moment. Miss Vane, she suspected, was hiding something, though what, she couldn't yet say. Dinner was served under the stars, a simple affair of grilled fish, roasted vegetables, and a crisp white wine. Mrs. Hartley dominated the talk, recounting a trip to Capri with her late husband. "He loved the sea," she said, her eyes misty. "Always said it kept no secrets." Miss Vane, seated beside her, stirred her soup, her expression unreadable. Dr. Lloyd offered a dry remark about tidal patterns, while Mrs. Lloyd, picking at her plate, said little. As the meal ended, Miss Marple excused herself, claiming fatigue. In truth, she wanted to think. She retired to her room, where moonlight spilled through the shutters, and sat by the window, her knitting idle in her lap. The villa was quiet, but the air felt charged, like the moment before a storm. She thought of Mrs. Hartley's easy trust, Miss Vane's taut restraint, the Lloyds' uneasy partnership. "People," she murmured, "are never quite what they seem." She recalled a case in her village, a seemingly accidental fall that proved to be a push. The signs had been there, in glances and hesitations, much like those she'd seen tonight. Miss Vane's smile, Dr. Lloyd's detachment, Mrs. Lloyd's nervous fingers. They were threads in a pattern, one she couldn't yet see whole. But she would watch, as she always did, and the truth, like a dropped stitch, would eventually reveal itself. Chapter 2. The Tragedy. The morning broke over St. Antoine with a sky of unblemished blue, the sea glittering like a sheet of polished glass. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the Villa Aurora's veranda, sipped her early tea and watched the small party prepare for their boat trip. Her bronchitis, she'd explained with a delicate cough, made such outings unwise, and so she remained behind, her knitting bag at her side. From her vantage point on the cliff, she could see the little motorboat bobbing at the dock, its white hull gleaming against the azure water. Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, in a wide-brimmed hat and a linen dress, was already aboard, her laughter carrying up the slope as she waved to Miss Vane. The companion, Clara, descended the stone steps with a canvas bag, her movements stiff, her face pale beneath a plain straw hat. Dr. Richard Lloyd followed, carrying a medical satchel and squinting at the horizon, while his wife Margaret trailed behind, her parasol trembling slightly in her grip. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the group's mood. Mrs. Hartley buoyant, Miss Vane subdued, the Lloyds oddly formal, as if attending a duty rather than a pleasure. The boat puttered out to sea at 9 o'clock, its engine a faint hum as it rounded the headland. Miss Marple, settling into her chair, opened her knitting, a pale pink scarf for her niece, and let her thoughts wander. She recalled a boating mishap in St. Mary Mead, where a young man's accident had been no accident at all. The sea, she mused, was a convenient stage for mishaps, its depths swallowing secrets with ease. By noon, the air had grown heavy, the sun high and unrelenting. Miss Marple, alerted by a commotion at the dock, set her needles aside and peered over the cliff. The boat was returning faster than expected, its occupants' postures rigid. As it neared, she saw Dr. Lloyd at the helm, his face grim, and Mrs. Lloyd clutching the rail, her scarf fluttering wildly. Miss Vane sat motionless, staring at the water, while Mrs. Hartley was conspicuously absent. The party disembarked in silence, their faces drawn as they climbed to the villa. Dr. Lloyd, spotting Miss Marple, approached with measured steps. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low, "there's been a tragedy. Mrs. Hartley, she's drowned." He explained in clipped tones. Mrs. Hartley had reached for her hat, blown overboard by a gust, and in leaning out, she'd slipped into the sea. A sudden current, he said, had pulled her under before anyone could act. Miss Vane had tried to grab her, but the water was too swift. Miss Marple's expression was one of gentle concern, but her mind was alert. "How dreadful," she murmured, her eyes flicking to Miss Vane, who stood apart, her hands clasped tightly. The companion's hat was askew, and a faint tremor ran through her shoulders. Mrs. Lloyd, meanwhile, was near collapse, her husband guiding her to a chair with a firmness that bordered on impatience. The local police arrived within the hour, led by Inspector Henri Dubois, a wiry man with a bristling moustache and a penchant for pacing. He questioned the group in the villa's airy salon, his notebook open, his questions sharp. Miss Vane, seated on a chintz sofa, recounted the incident in a voice barely above a whisper. "It happened so quickly," she said. "Evelyn's hat flew off, and she reached for it. I lunged to hold her, but she was gone." Her eyes, red-rimmed, avoided Dubois' gaze, settling instead on a point beyond the window. Dr. Lloyd corroborated the account, emphasizing the current's strength. "I've seen such things in these waters," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Unpredictable eddies, especially near the cove." Mrs. Lloyd, when pressed, could only nod, her words dissolving into a sob. Dubois scribbled furiously, then announced that the Coast Guard would search for the body, though he warned that the sea might not yield it. "Currents," he said with a shrug, "are merciless." Miss Marple, knitting quietly in a corner, listened without comment. The story was consistent, each witness echoing the others, yet it felt polished, like a rehearsed performance. She thought of a village drowning years ago, where the truth had lain not in what was said, but in what was omitted. The hat, she noted, was a curious detail, blown off, yet central to the tragedy, and Miss Vane's attempt to save her employer seemed noble, but her trembling hands suggested more than grief. As Dubois departed, promising updates, Miss Marple rose, her movements slow but purposeful. She approached Miss Vane, who was gathering her shawl. "My dear," she said softly, "you must be shaken. To lose someone so suddenly, it's a heavy burden." Miss Vane's lips parted, but no words came. For a moment, her eyes met Miss Marple's, and in them, the older woman saw a flash of something, fear, perhaps, or defiance. Then Miss Vane murmured an excuse and hurried away. Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking steadily. The sea, she reflected, kept no secrets, as Mrs. Hartley had claimed, but people did. And in the villa's sudden silence, she sensed a secret taking shape, one she would unravel, thread by careful thread. Chapter 3. The Companion's Tale. The Villa Aurora, draped in the sombre hush of tragedy, seemed to hold its breath under the weight of Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's death. The Mediterranean sun, unrelenting, poured through the tall windows of the drawing-room where Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual corner, her knitting needles moving with a soft rhythmic click. The pale pink scarf for her niece grew steadily, a delicate counterpoint to the tension that clung to the air like damp mist. Outside, the sea sparkled with deceptive calm, its surface belying the currents that had, so the story went, claimed a life. Miss Marple, her mild eyes half closed, was not deceived. She had seen too many village dramas, griefs too loud, tears too dry, to take any tale at face value. The household moved through the morning in a state of uneasy suspension. Dr. Richard Lloyd, his scientific demeanour unshaken, had taken to, pacing the terrace, muttering about tidal charts and the unpredictability of coastal waters. His wife Margaret hovered near the French doors, her delicate hands twisting a lace handkerchief into knots. Miss Clara Vane, Mrs. Hartley's companion, was the least visible, her presence marked only by the occasional creak of a floorboard from her room upstairs. Inspector Henri Dubois had left an hour ago, promising to return with news of the Coast Guard's search, but the absence of a body hung over the villa like an unanswered question. Miss Marple, sipping a cup of weak tea brought by the villa's sole maid, a taciturn local named Marie, let her thoughts drift. The drowning, as described, was plausible enough. A gust of wind, a lost hat, a fatal reach over the boat's edge. Yet plausibility, she knew, was the cleverest mask for deceit. In St. Mary Mead, she had once unravelled a theft disguised as a charity collection, the culprit's story as smooth as Sunday sermon. Here, the smoothness of the boat party's account, Miss Vane's failed rescue, Dr. Lloyd's talk of currents, Mrs. Lloyd's tearful corroboration stirred her suspicion. It was not what they said, but how they said it, rehearsed, almost scripted, with no ragged edges of genuine shock. Her gaze settled on the empty chair where Mrs. Hartley had sat only yesterday, her laughter filling the room as she planned the ill-fated outing. A generous woman, Miss Marple reflected, but not a discerning one. Wealth, she had observed, often bred a dangerous trust, blinding its possessor to the hungers it awakened in others. And Miss Vane, with her sharp features and guarded eyes, had been closest to that wealth. A companion's role, Miss Marple knew, was a curious one, part servant, part confidant, privy to secrets yet rarely secure. In her village, a governess had once poisoned her employer's tea, driven by resentment cloaked in loyalty. Miss Vane's loyalty, she suspected, warranted closer scrutiny. The opportunity came after lunch, a subdued meal of cold meats and salad, served on the veranda. Dr. Lloyd, citing a headache, retired to his room, and Mrs. Lloyd, murmuring about letters to write, followed suit. Miss Vane, who had picked at her food in silence, lingered, her thin fingers tracing the rim of a water glass. Miss Marple, sensing her moment, set her knitting aside and rose, her movements slow to suggest frailty rather than purpose. "Miss Vane," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "might we take a turn in the garden? The air is so refreshing, and I find company a comfort after such a shock." Miss Vane hesitated, her lips parting as if to decline. But Miss Marple's gentle smile, so disarming in its innocence, seemed to sway her. "Of course," she said at last, her tone flat. They stepped into the garden, where oleanders bloomed in vivid pinks and whites, their scent mingling with the salt of the sea. The path wound through neat beds of lavender, and Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her stick, kept her pace unhurried, her chatter inconsequential, remarks on the flowers, the warmth of the sun, the charm of St. Antoine. "You must find this place a change from Devon," she said, pausing to admire a rose. "Mrs. Hartley spoke so fondly of her home there. Were you with her long?" Miss Vane's eyes flicked toward the sea, then back to the path. "3 years," she said. "Since her husband passed, she needed someone to manage her affairs, letters, travel, that sort of thing." Her voice was measured, but Miss Marple caught the slight tightening of her jaw, as if the question probed too near a nerve. "Such a responsibility," Miss Marple murmured, her tone all sympathy, "and so isolating, I imagine, to be always at another's side. In my village we had a lady's maid who felt quite cut off, poor thing. Did you find it so?" Miss Vane's fingers brushed a lavender sprig, releasing a faint fragrance. "Not really," she said. "Evelyn was kind. She treated me almost as a friend." The words were warm, but her eyes remained cool, and Miss Marple noted the past tense, as if Mrs. Hartley's kindness were already a distant memory. They reached a stone bench overlooking the cliff, and Miss Marple, claiming a need to rest, sat, patting the space beside her. Miss Vane joined her, her posture rigid, her hands clasped in her lap. The sea stretched before them, its surface unbroken save for the occasional flash of a gull's wing. Miss Marple let the silence settle, knowing that quiet often loosened tongues more than questions. "She loved the sea," Miss Vane said suddenly, her voice low. "She'd sit here for hours, talking about her husband's ships, their voyages. I think it reminded her of him." Her fingers twisted a fold of her skirt, and Miss Marple saw, for the first time, a crack in her composure, a fleeting tremor, quickly suppressed. "How touching!" Miss Marple said, her voice a soothing hum. "You must have been a great comfort to her, to lose someone so suddenly. It's a wound, isn't it? I remember a young woman in my village, drowned in a pond. Her sister was never the same." She paused, her eyes soft but searching. "You tried so hard to save her, they say." Miss Vane's breath caught, a sound so faint it might have been the breeze. "I did," she said, her voice barely audible. "I reached for her, but the water, it was too fast." She turned her head, her profile sharp against the sky, and Miss Marple saw the effort it took to hold her gaze steady. "Of course," Miss Marple said, nodding as if satisfied. "It must haunt you, those moments. But you mustn't blame yourself, my dear. The sea is cruel." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome, and changed the subject to the villa's roses, letting Miss Vane retreat into silence. The conversation, brief as it was, had been revealing. Miss Vane's grief, Miss Marple thought, was a performance, convincing to most, but not to one who had seen true sorrow in the reddened eyes of a village widow or the trembling hands of a bereaved mother. Miss Vane's eyes were dry, her hands steady save for that one unguarded moment. And her story, though consistent with the others, lacked the raw edge of truth. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had known a shopgirl who lied about a theft, her tale polished but betrayed by a nervous tic. Miss Vane's tic, she suspected, was in her hands. Those restless fingers, always moving, always hiding. As they returned to the villa, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the hat. That curious detail from the boat. A hat blown off. A reach to retrieve it. A fatal slip, neat, but improbable. She recalled a case where a lost glove had been the pretext for a staged fall, the truth buried in the victim's own habits. Mrs. Hartley, she remembered, had secured her hat with a pin at dinner, a practical gesture for a woman who knew the sea's whims. Why, then, had it flown free so easily? And why had Miss Vane, so quick to act, failed to save her? The afternoon brought Inspector Dubois, his moustache bristling with frustration. He joined Miss Marple on the veranda, where she offered him tea, which he declined with a Gallic wave. "No body yet," he said, pacing. "The Coast Guard searches, but the currents, pah, they mock us." He lowered his voice, glancing toward the house. "I question the companion again, but she says nothing new. Always the same, the hat, the reach, the water. Too perfect, non?" Miss Marple's needles paused. "Perfection," she said mildly, "is often a sign of care. In my village, a man once planned a burglary so well that every detail matched, except his boots, which left mud where none should be." She smiled, her eyes twinkling. "Have you found the hat, Inspecteur?" Dubois blinked, caught off guard. "Oui, it was recovered, floating near the cove. A wide-brimmed thing, straw, with a ribbon. Why do you ask?" "No reason," Miss Marple said, resuming her knitting. "Only that small things, a hat, a scarf, can tell stories. Was it damaged?" Dubois frowned, then nodded. "The brim, it was torn, as if caught on something. Perhaps the boat's edge." He shrugged, dismissing it. But Miss Marple's mind seized the detail. A torn brim suggested force, not a gentle gust. She pictured Mrs. Hartley leaning out, Miss Vane's hands reaching, not to save, but to push. The thought was bold, but not impossible. She had seen worse in her quiet village. A wife who'd tampered with a ladder, a brother who'd loosened a wheel. Motive, she knew, would be the key. That evening, as the villa settled into an uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by, her window the moonlight silvering the olive groves. She thought of Miss Vane's role. 3 years at Mrs. Hartley's side, privy to her wealth, her plans, her weaknesses. A companion, she reflected, was ideally placed to exploit trust, to weave herself into a life until she became indispensable. But indispensability could breed resentment or greed or fear. Miss Vane's past, she suspected, held the answer. A woman so guarded, so careful, was running from something, or toward it. She recalled a conversation with Mrs. Hartley just 2 days ago about her plans for the future. "I've been thinking of my will," the widow had said, her voice casual. "Clara's been such a help, but I must think of others too." Miss Vane had been present, Miss Marple remembered, her face impassive, but her hands still, as if frozen. Had that comment planted a seed? Or had a plan already been in motion? Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. her mind weaving a pattern from the threads of the day. Miss Vane's dry eyes, her restless hands, the torn hat, the missing body. The sea, she thought, was a vast accomplice, but it could not hide everything. In St. Mary Mead, truth had a way of surfacing, like a stone dislodged from a streambed. Here, in the Villa Aurora, she would find it, not by confrontation, but by watching, listening, and letting the guilty betray themselves. As she prepared for bed, slipping her knitting into its bag, she paused by the window, her gaze on the dark sea. People, she murmured, are their own undoing. And with that, she drew the curtains, her mind already on the next day's quiet inquiries. Chapter 4. The Doctor's Opinion. The Villa Aurora awoke to a morning cloaked in a thin, silvery mist, the kind that clung to the cliffs of St. Antoine and softened the Mediterranean's edges. Miss Jane Marple, ever an early riser, sat by her bedroom window, her frail hands wrapped around a cup of tea as she watched the mist curl over the olive groves. The villa was silent save for the distant clatter of Marie, the maid, preparing breakfast in the kitchen. Miss Marple's thoughts, however, were far from tranquil. The tragedy of Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's drowning had settled over the household like a pall, and the neatness of the story, hat lost, reach made, current blamed, gnawed at her. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth often hid in the cracks of a too perfect tale, like dust swept under a rug. The previous day's revelations, the torn hat, Miss Clara Vane's guarded demeanour, the absent body, had sharpened her suspicions. Miss Marple's mind, as delicate and precise as the lace she knitted, turned now to Dr. Richard Lloyd. His brisk assurance about the sea's treachery had struck her as oddly pat, a scientist's explanation delivered with the confidence of a barrister. She recalled a village doctor who'd once misdiagnosed a poisoning as heart failure, his certainty masking either incompetence or intent. Dr. Lloyd, she decided, warranted a closer look. Breakfast was a subdued affair, served in the dining room with its wide windows overlooking the sea. Miss Marple, dressed in a lavender cardigan and her usual sensible shoes, took her place at the table, her knitting bag tucked discreetly at her feet. Miss Vane was absent, pleading a headache, but Dr. Lloyd and his wife Margaret were present, their conversation stilted. Mrs. Lloyd, her eyes shadowed from sleeplessness, pushed a slice of toast around her plate, while Dr. Lloyd, in a tweed jacket despite the warmth, read a medical journal, his spectacles glinting in the morning light. Miss Marple, buttering a roll, ventured a gentle remark. "Such a peaceful view," she said, nodding toward the sea. "Hard to imagine it could be so cruel, as you described, Dr. Lloyd." Her tone was mild, her eyes soft, but the question hung in the air like a moth circling a lamp. Dr. Lloyd lowered his journal, his expression one of practised patience. "Indeed, Miss Marple," he said, "the Mediterranean may look serene, but its currents are notorious. Near the cove especially, there's an undertow that can catch even the strongest swimmer." He spoke with the authority of a man accustomed to being believed, his voice clipped and precise. Mrs. Lloyd, glancing up, added in a faltering tone, "Evelyn loved the water. She was always so carefree." Her fingers twisted her napkin, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in them, the same nervous tick she'd seen at dinner 2 nights ago. Grief, she knew, could unsteady a hand, but so could guilt or fear. How tragic, Miss Marple said, her voice all sympathy. Was she a strong swimmer, then? One does hear of such accidents, but often with those less skilled. She sipped her tea, her gaze resting lightly on Dr. Lloyd. He hesitated, just a fraction, enough for Miss Marple to notice. Moderately, he said at last, adjusting his spectacles. She wasn't an athlete, but she managed well enough. The current, though, it was too much for anyone. He returned to his journal, a clear signal the topic was closed, but Miss Marple's mind was already at work. A moderate swimmer, caught by a sudden current, yet no cry for help, no struggle noted by the others. In her village, a farmer had drowned in a stream, but his thrashing had drawn every soul within earshot. Silence in drowning, she thought, was a curious thing. The morning passed quietly, with Miss Marple retreating to the veranda to knit and think. The mist had lifted, revealing a sky of piercing blue, and the sea stretched before her, its surface as smooth as glass. She pictured the boat, the moment of the accident, Mrs. Hartley reaching, Miss Vane lunging, Dr. Lloyd at the helm, Mrs. Lloyd watching. Each had played a part in the story, but Dr. Lloyd's role intrigued her most. His medical expertise lent weight to the tale, yet expertise, she knew, could be wielded like a shield or a weapon. Her chance to probe further came in the late afternoon, when Inspector Henri Dubois arrived, his moustache bristling with impatience. He had come to update the household, though his news was sparse. The Coast Guard's search continued, but no body had been found, and the hat, now stored at the station, offered no new clues. Dr. Lloyd, summoned from his study, joined Dubois and Miss Marple in the drawing-room, where a tray of sherry had been set out by Marie. Mrs. Lloyd, claiming fatigue, remained upstairs, and Miss Vane was still secluded. Dubois, pacing before the fireplace, gestured animatedly. "This current," he said, "it vexes me. You, doctor, you know the sea here. Is it truly so deadly?" His tone was sceptical, his eyes narrowing as he studied Dr. Lloyd. Dr. Lloyd, seated in a high-backed chair, crossed his legs and adopted a lecturing air. "Absolutely," he said. "I've studied the coastal patterns, part of my interest in marine biology. The cove where the accident occurred is known for its eddies, formed by the convergence of two tidal streams. Even a strong swimmer would struggle." He leaned forward, his voice earnest. "I examined Mrs. Hartley myself 2 weeks ago, at her request. She was in excellent health, no heart trouble, no dizzy spells. Drowning, I'm afraid, is the only explanation." Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, tilted her head. "How thorough of you," she said, her voice as soft as a whisper. "In my village, our doctor was much the same, always checking pulses and such. Did Mrs. Hartley swim often, then, to need such a check?" Dr. Lloyd blinked, caught off guard. "Not often," he admitted. "She'd mentioned a slight cough, nothing serious. I merely confirmed her fitness." He smiled, but it was a tight smile, and Miss Marple noted the way his fingers tapped the armrest, a rhythm too quick for ease. Dubois, less subtle, pressed further. "And you saw nothing odd? No struggle, no hesitation from the others?" His question was blunt, and Dr. Lloyd's jaw tightened. "None," he said firmly. "It was sudden. Miss Vane tried to help, but the sea was too strong. I was at the helm, focused on steering. Margaret, Mrs. Lloyd, was beside me, too shocked to act. He spread his hands as if the matter were settled. Miss Marple's needles clicked, a steady counterpoint to the tension. She thought of a village chemist who'd sworn a death was natural, only to be undone by a misplaced vial. Dr. Lloyd's account was seamless, but seams, she knew, could hide stitches. His mention of the examination intrigued her. A cough, however slight, was an odd reason for a checkup, especially for a woman who by all accounts was robust, and his insistence on the current felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared the words in advance. As Dubois prepared to leave, Miss Marple ventured one more question, her tone as innocent as a child's. "Dr. Lloyd, you must see many accidents in your work. Is it common for a drowning to be so quiet? I recall a case in St. Mary Mead, a boy in the river. Such a commotion, everyone heard." She smiled, her eyes twinkling with apparent naivety. Dr. Lloyd's face stiffened, but he recovered. Quickly. "Not uncommon," he said. "Shock can silence a victim, or the water itself, swallowed too fast. Mrs. Hartley had no chance to cry out." He rose, signalling the end of the discussion, and excused himself to check on his wife. Dubois, lingering, turned to Miss Marple. "You ask much, mademoiselle," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "This hat, now this silence. You think like a detective." Miss Marple chuckled, her needles pausing. "Oh, hardly, Inspecteur. I'm only an old woman who notices things. In my village, people talk and I listen. Sometimes what they don't say is loudest." She resumed her knitting, leaving Dubois to ponder her words as he departed. Alone, Miss Marple let her thoughts unravel. Dr. Lloyd's certainty troubled her. His medical opinion anchored the drowning story, yet it rested on assumptions. A healthy woman, a treacherous sea, a silent end. She recalled Mrs. Hartley's vitality, her laughter, her pinned hat at dinner. A woman so practical would not lean recklessly over a boat's edge, nor drown without a sound. And Dr. Lloyd's examination, why now for a cough? In St. Mary Mead, a doctor's word had once cloaked a murder, the truth buried in a forged prescription. Here, she suspected, the truth lay in what Dr. Lloyd omitted. Her mind turned to Mrs. Lloyd, whose nervous gestures, twisted napkins, bitten nails, hinted at more than grief. Was she afraid of her husband, or complicit in his story? Miss Marple pictured her on the boat, watching as Mrs. Hartley fell. Had she seen something she dared not say? In her village, a wife had once kept silent about her husband's theft, her fear stronger than her conscience. Mrs. Lloyd, she decided, was another thread to follow. As evening fell, the villa grew quiet, the sea a dark mirror under a crescent moon. Miss Marple, dining alone in her room, reviewed the day's clues. The torn hat, Miss Vane's dry eyes, Dr. Lloyd's polished answers, Mrs. Lloyd's unease. Each was a piece of a puzzle, incomplete but suggestive. She thought of the cove, its hidden eddies, and wondered if the sea was truly the villain, or merely a convenient scapegoat. Finishing her meal, she took up her knitting, her needles moving with purpose. People, she murmured, build their own traps. In St. Mary Mead, truth had always surfaced, like a cork in a stream. Here, in the Villa Aurora, She would wait, watch, and let the trap spring, revealing the hand that set it. Chapter 5. The Missing Will. The Villa Aurora stood sentinel over the cliffs of St. Antoine, its whitewashed walls catching the pale light of a dawn still tinged with the memory of mist. Miss Jane Marple, awake before the household, sat in her room with a shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting idle in her lap. The sea beyond her window was a restless expanse, its waves whispering secrets it refused to yield. 4 days had passed since Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's drowning, and the absence of her body, coupled with the torn hat and the too smooth accounts of the boat party, had woven a tapestry of doubt in Miss Marple's mind. She thought of St. Mary Mead, where a missing letter had once unravelled a theft. Here, she sensed, something equally vital was amiss. The household stirred slowly, its rhythm disrupted by grief, or the pretence of it. Miss Clara Vane, the companion, had grown more withdrawn, her sharp features shadowed by what might have been exhaustion or fear. Dr. Richard Lloyd maintained his scientific detachment, his talk of currents and eddies as crisp as ever, while his wife Margaret seemed to shrink further into herself, her nervous gestures more pronounced. Inspector Henri Dubois, though diligent, was frustrated, his daily visits yielding little beyond the Coast Guard's fruitless reports. Miss Marple, knitting quietly in her corner, watched them all, her mild eyes missing nothing. People, she knew, betrayed themselves in small ways. A glance, a pause, a hand that trembled. The morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple's old friend and the villa's owner, who had arrived from England to offer condolences and oversee any arrangements. She swept into the drawing-room at 10 o'clock, her tweed suit slightly rumpled from travel, her voice as hearty as ever despite the sombre occasion. "Jane, my dear," she exclaimed, embracing Miss Marple with a vigour that belied her 60 years. "What a dreadful business, poor Evelyn, gone like that. I came as soon as I heard." Miss Marple, setting her knitting aside, smiled warmly. "Dolly, how good of you to come. It's been a shock, hasn't it? Such a lively woman, Mrs. Hartley." Her tone was gentle, but her eyes were alert, noting the faint lines of worry on her friend's face. Mrs. Bantry, she knew, was no fool. Her gossip, though breezy, often carried nuggets of truth. The others gathered for coffee, summoned by Marie's quiet efficiency. Miss Vane appeared, her dark hair pulled tightly back, her face pale as porcelain. Dr. Lloyd, in a crisp linen shirt, adjusted his spectacles while Mrs. Lloyd, clutching a shawl, sat close to her husband, her eyes darting to the door. Mrs. Bantry, taking the lead, expressed her sympathies, her words sincere but tinged with curiosity. "Evelyn was such a dear," she said, sipping her coffee. "Always so generous. I suppose she'd made plans for her estate." The question, innocent enough, hung in the air. Miss Vane's cup clinked against its saucer, a sound sharp in the Ainshire. Silence. "I wouldn't know," she said quickly, her voice low. "Evelyn didn't discuss such things with me." Her fingers, Miss Marple noted, gripped the cup too tightly, the knuckles whitening. Mrs. Bantry, undeterred, pressed on. "Oh, but she must have, Clara. You were her right hand, weren't you? I had a letter from her solicitor just before I left. Mr. Pritchard, in London. He was quite flustered, said her will was missing from his safe. Recently revised, apparently, but nowhere to be found. Odd, isn't it? Miss Marple's needles, which had resumed their rhythm, paused. A missing will was no small matter. Defend St. Mary Mead, a lost codicil, had sparked a feud that ended in bloodshed, the truth buried in a solicitor's misplaced trust. She glanced at Miss Vane, whose face had drained of what little colour it held. "Missing?" the companion echoed, her voice barely audible. "She never mentioned a new will." Dr. Lloyd cleared his throat, his tone measured. "That's not unusual, Mrs. Bantry. People often revise their wills privately. Perhaps it's misfiled." His words were reasonable, but Miss Marple caught the quick glance he exchanged with his wife, whose fingers twisted her shawl into knots. Mrs. Bantry shrugged, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Misfiled or not, it's a puzzle. Evelyn hinted to me last month, in a letter, that she'd made some generous bequests. 'To those who deserve it,' she wrote. I assumed Clara would be included, being so devoted." She smiled at Miss Vane, who stared at her coffee, her lips pressed into a thin line. Miss Marple, sipping her own coffee, felt a spark of clarity. A missing will suggested motive, greed, fear, or betrayal. Mrs. Hartley's wealth, so carelessly displayed, had likely drawn eyes, and Miss Vane, as her constant shadow, was best placed to know its extent. Had she expected a legacy, only to learn of a change? Or had she acted to prevent one? In her village, a housekeeper had once forged a will to secure her future. Miss Vane's pallor, her trembling hands, hinted at a similar desperation. The conversation shifted to practicalities, Mrs. Hartley's London flat, her charitable causes, but Miss Marple's mind remained on the will. She recalled a snatch of talk from Mrs. Hartley, days before the tragedy, about setting things right. The widow had been vague, her tone light, but Miss Vane had been present, her face impassive. Had that moment planted a seed of panic, or had a plan already taken root? After coffee, Mrs. Bantry drew Miss Marple aside, her voice lowered. "Jane, there's something off here," she said, her eyes sharp. "Evelyn wasn't the sort to lose a will. And Clara, did you see her face like she'd seen a ghost? What do you make of it?" Miss Marple, folding her shawl, smiled faintly. "People are complex, Dolly. In my village, a missing document often meant someone wanted it gone. But we mustn't jump to conclusions. I find a quiet walk clears the mind." Her tone was airy, but her mind was anything but. She suggested a stroll to the village, knowing Mrs. Bantry's presence would loosen tongues or tighten nerves. The walk, through sun-dappled lanes lined with cypress and rosemary, was a chance to observe. Miss Vane declined to join, citing letters to write, but Dr. Lloyd and his wife accompanied them, their steps slow to match Miss Marple's. Mrs. Bantry, chattering about London gossip, kept the mood light, but Miss Marple steered the talk to Mrs. Hartley. "Such a generous soul," she said, her voice soft. "I suppose her will would reflect that. Did she ever mention her plans, Dr. Lloyd?" Dr. Lloyd, squinting against the sun, shook his head. "Not to me," he said. "She was healthy. No reason to dwell on such things. My examination confirmed that. Fit as a fiddle, bar a slight cough." His tone was brisk, but Miss Marple noted the way his hand tightened on his walking stick, a gesture too controlled for ease. Mrs. Lloyd, trailing behind, murmured, "She was kind to everyone. I'm sure she'd have thought of those close to her." Her voice faltered, and Miss Marple saw her bite her lip, her eyes darting to her husband. Fear, she thought, or knowledge. In St. Mary Mead, a wife had once known her husband's secret, but kept silent, her loyalty a cage. Mrs. Lloyd, she suspected, was trapped in a similar bind. The village, a cluster of whitewashed houses around, a small square, offered a brief distraction. Mrs. Bantry bought postcards, while Miss Marple chatted with a local shopkeeper, her French halting but effective. The woman, plump and talkative, mentioned the drowning. Her voice hushed. "Such a shame," she said. "The sea takes what it wants. But that cove, it's cursed, they say." Miss Marple nodded, her mind on the cove's role. A cursed cove was a convenient myth, much like a treacherous current. Back at the villa, Miss Marple retired to the veranda, her knitting a pretext for solitude. The will, she thought, was the pivot. Its absence suggested someone had acted to control Mrs. Hartley's legacy, or to obscure it. Miss Vane, as the companion, was the obvious suspect, her access to Mrs. Hartley's papers unmatched. But Dr. Lloyd's quick dismissal of the will's loss and his wife's unease hinted at a wider net. Had they known of the revision, or had they, too, expected a share? She recalled a detail from Mrs. Bantry's letter, Mrs. Hartley's hint at generous bequests. To whom? A distant relative, a charity, or someone closer. In her village, a farmer's will had sparked a murder when it favoured an outsider over kin. Here, the stakes were higher, the players more guarded. Miss Vane's reaction to the will's mention, her pallor, her silence, spoke of knowledge or dread. Had she seen the new will, or destroyed it, or was she protecting another secret? As evening fell, Inspector Dubois arrived, his face etched with frustration. Over sherry in the drawing-room, he shared his latest findings. The Coast Guard had found nothing, and the hat's torn brim offered no clear evidence. But, he added, his eyes narrowing, I learned something new. Mrs. Hartley's solicitor confirms the will was revised a month ago, signed and witnessed. It was in his safe until last week, when he found it gone. No break-in, no trace. He looked at Miss Vane, who sat stiffly by the window, her hands folded. "You knew her affairs, mademoiselle. Did she speak of this?" Miss Vane's voice was steady, but her eyes flicked to the floor. "No," she said. "She handled such matters herself. I only wrote her letters, booked her travel." Her denial was swift, but Miss Marple saw the pulse at her throat, a faint beat of nerves. Dubois pressed, his tone sharp. "And you, doctor? You examined her. Did she seem preoccupied? A new will is a big step." Dr. Lloyd, sipping his sherry, shook his head. "Not at all," he said. "She was cheerful, as always. My check-up was routine." His wife, silent, stared at her hands, her nails bitten to the quick. Miss Marple, her knitting a soft rhythm, ventured a question. "Inspecteur, in my village, a lost will once turned up in a desk, overlooked. Might Mrs. Hartley have kept a copy here?" Her tone was guileless, but her eyes were sharp, watching Miss Vane's reaction. The companion's head jerked up, her lips parting. I wouldn't know," she said, her voice catching. "Her papers are in her room, but I haven't touched them." The lie, if it was one, was clumsy, and Miss Marple filed it away, like a dropped stitch in her knitting. Dubois, intrigued, promised to search the villa. though he doubted the will would surface. As he left, Miss Marple remained, her mind weaving a pattern from the day's threads. The missing will, Miss Vane's fear, Dr. Lloyd's calm, Mrs. Lloyd's silence. The will, she thought, was no mere document. It was a motive, a spark that could ignite a hidden truth. In St. Mary Mead, motives had always led to answers, whether greed, envy, or fear. Here she sensed a tangle of all three. As night cloaked, the villa, Miss Marple sat by her window, the sea a dark murmur below. Her needles moved steadily, crafting the scarf that would warm her niece's winter. But her true work was invisible, a quiet unravelling of human nature. "Money," she murmured, "makes monsters of us all." And in the Villa Aurora, she would find the monster not with fanfare, but with the patience of a woman who knew the power of a single, well-placed question. Chapter 6. A Shadow from the Past. The Villa Aurora, perched on the cliffs of St. Antoine, seemed to shimmer under the midday sun, its white walls reflecting a light that belied the darkness within. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary wicker chair on the veranda, adjusted her shawl against a faint breeze that carried the tang of salt and oleander. Her knitting, the pale pink scarf for her niece, lay in her lap, its needles silent for the moment as she gazed at the Mediterranean, its surface a deceptive mirror of calm. 5 days had passed since Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's drowning, and the villa's air was thick with unspoken questions. The missing will, the torn hat, the absent body, these were threads in a pattern Miss Marple could not yet fully discern. But she was patient. In St. Mary Mead, truths had always emerged, like weeds breaking through cracked earth, and she trusted they would hear. The household moved through its grief with varying degrees of conviction. Miss Clara Vane, the companion, had grown almost spectral, her sharp features drawn, her presence confined to brief appearances at meals. Dr. Richard Lloyd, ever the scientist, maintained a facade of detached efficiency, his talk of tidal charts now tempered by a guarded edge. His wife, Margaret, was a study in fragility, her bitten nails and darting eyes betraying a turmoil she could not voice. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose arrival had stirred the pot with news of the missing will, remained, a lively counterpoint, her gossip a lens through which Miss Marple glimpsed new angles. Inspector Henry Dubois, dogged but stymied, visited daily, his frustration palpable as the sea yielded no body and the villa no answers. Miss Marple's mind, as sharp as the needles she wielded, turned to Miss Vane, the companion's reaction to the will's mention. Her pallor, her trembling hands, had been a crack in her carefully constructed mask. Miss Marple recalled a village seamstress who'd fled a scandal, her new name betrayed by a nervous habit. Miss Vane's guardedness suggested a similar flight. A companion she knew was uniquely positioned, close to wealth, privy to secrets, yet vulnerable to dismissal. Had Miss Vane seen a threat in the new will, or something deeper in Mrs. Hartley's life? The answer, Miss Marple suspected, lay not in the present, but in the past Miss Vane so carefully hid. The opportunity to probe came unexpectedly after lunch, a quiet meal of gazpacho and crusty bread served in the dining room. Mrs. Bantry, regaling the group with tales of her Devon garden, had excused herself to write letters, while Dr. Lloyd and his wife retired to the terrace, ostensibly to read. Miss Vane, lingering over her coffee, seemed poised to vanish upstairs when Miss Marple, with the disarming gentleness of a grandmother, intervened. "Miss Vane," she said, her voice soft as a lullaby, "I find the garden so soothing after a meal. Would you join me? I do dislike walking alone." Miss Vane's eyes flickered with reluctance, but Miss Marple's smile, so mild and expectant, left little room for refusal. "Very well," she murmured, setting her cup down with a clink. They stepped into the garden, where sunlight dappled the paths and lavender scented the air. Miss Marple, leaning lightly on her stick, kept her pace slow, her chatter as light as the breeze. Remarks on the roses, the warmth of the day, the charm of the villa's seclusion. "You must have travelled much with Mrs. Hartley," Miss Marple said, pausing to inspect a blooming hibiscus. "Such a change from England's damp winters. Where were you before Devon, my dear? I always think a companion's life is so adventurous." Her tone was all curiosity, her eyes soft but searching. Miss Vane's step faltered, a misstep quickly corrected. "Here and there," she said, her voice clipped. "I was a governess for a time in various households. Nothing remarkable." Her fingers brushed a lavender sprig, releasing a faint fragrance, and Miss Marple noted the way they lingered, as if seeking distraction. "How interesting," Miss Marple said, nodding, as if satisfied. "In my village we had a governess once. Such a quiet girl, but she'd seen such places. Did you enjoy it, teaching children?" She resumed her walk, her stick tapping the path, giving Miss Vane no time to retreat. "It was work," Miss Vane said, her tone flat, "but I preferred companionship, less demanding." She glanced at the sea, her profile sharp against the sky, and Miss Marple saw a tightening in her jaw, a sign of strain she'd come to recognize. They reached a wooden bench overlooking the cliff, and Miss Marple, claiming a need to rest, sat, patting the space beside her. Miss Vane joined her, her posture stiff, her hands clasped in her lap. The sea stretched before them, its waves a rhythmic murmur, and Miss Marple let the silence grow, knowing it could be as probing as any question. In St. Mary Mead, silence had once coaxed a confession from a poacher. Here she hoped it would loosen Miss Vane's guard. "She trusted you so," Miss Marple said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mrs. Hartley, I mean. It must be hard carrying that trust now she's gone. I remember a lady's maid in my village so devoted, but she carried such a burden when her mistress died." She paused, her eyes on the horizon, giving Miss Vane space to respond. Miss Vane's hands twitched, a fleeting movement. "Evelyn was good to me," she said, her voice low. "I did my best for her." The words were simple, but Miss Marple caught the strain beneath them, like a note played off-key. "Of course you did," Miss Marple said, her tone all sympathy. "And you tried to save her, so brave. It's a heavy thing to lose someone so suddenly." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly, and shifted the subject to the villa's history, letting Miss Vane retreat into silence. The conversation, brief as it was, had been telling. Miss Vane's past, so vaguely sketched, was a locked door, and her reluctance to open it spoke of secrets she dared not share. The afternoon brought Inspector Dubois, his moustache bristling with a new lead. He joined Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry in the drawing-room, where a tray of tea had been set out. Dr. Lloyd and his wife were absent, and Miss Vane had vanished upstairs, leaving the trio to confer. Dubois, pacing before the fireplace, lowered his voice. "I have news, mesdames," he said, his eyes gleaming. "The companion, Mademoiselle Vane, her references they are, how you say, flimsy. She gave a Mrs. Grayson as her employer before Mrs. Hartley. But this Mrs. Grayson is dead, and no one can confirm the story. Her other claims, governess, secretary, are vague, no addresses, no names." Mrs. Bantry, stirring her tea, raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's fishy, isn't it? Evelyn wasn't one to check references, mind you. Too trusting by half. But dead employers? That's convenient." Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp, and Miss Marple smiled inwardly. Dolly, for all her bluster, had a nose for trouble. Marple's needles clicked steadily. "How curious," she said, her voice mild. "In my village, a new housemaid once gave a false reference. Ran off with the silver, poor thing. People hide their pasts for all sorts of reasons, don't they, Inspecteur?" Her eyes twinkled, but her mind was racing. A fabricated past suggested Miss Vane was not who she claimed. A fugitive, perhaps, or someone escaping a scandal. In St. Mary Mead, a false identity had once masked a bigamist. Here the stakes felt higher. Dubois, intrigued, leaned forward. "You think she lies, mademoiselle? I have cabled London, asked for records. If she is not Clara Vane, we will know." He paused, his moustache twitching. But why hide? And why now, with this drowning? Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "People hide when they fear discovery," she said. "As for why now, well, a will, a death, a fortune. These things stir the pot, don't they? In my village, a missing ring brought out all sorts of truths." She smiled, leaving Dubois to ponder as he scribbled in his notebook. Mrs. Bantry, catching her friend's drift, changed the subject to the villa's upkeep, giving Miss Marple time to think. Miss Vane's vague past was a key, but to what lock? Had she joined Mrs. Hartley to exploit her wealth, only to find the new will a threat? Or was her secret older, tied to a life she'd fled? The drowning, Miss Marple suspected, was no accident, but a desperate act, its roots in whatever Miss Vane concealed. The torn hat, the missing will, the silent fall, all pointed to a plan, and Miss Vane, with her access and her nerves, was at its heart. That evening, Dubois summoned Miss Vane to the drawing-room, his manner formal. Miss Marple, invited to observe, sat quietly, her knitting a prop for her watchfulness. Dr. Lloyd and Mrs. Lloyd were present, their faces tense, while Mrs. Bantry hovered, her curiosity barely contained. Dubois, standing by the mantel, fixed Miss Vane with a piercing gaze. "Mademoiselle," he said, "your references, they do not hold. This Mrs. Grayson, she is dead, and no one knows you. Who are you, truly?" Miss Vane, seated on a chintz sofa, stiffened, her hands clasped tightly. "I am Clara Vane," she said, her voice steady, but her eyes darting to the door. "Mrs. Grayson was my employer years ago. She died, and I moved on. I value my privacy, Inspector, nothing more." Her words were firm, but Miss Marple saw the pulse at her throat, the slight tremor in her fingers. In her village, a liar's tells had always been physical. A twitch, a flush, and Miss Vane's were clear. Dubois pressed, his tone sharp. "Privacy or secrecy? You were close to Madam Hartley, her papers, her plans. This will missing. Did you know of it?" His question was a dart, and Miss Vane flinched. "I knew nothing," she said, her voice rising. "Evelyn handled her own affairs. I was her companion, not her confidant." She stood, her movements abrupt. "I'm tired, Inspector. May I go?" Dubois, after a moment, nodded, but his eyes followed her as she left, a predator sizing up prey. Miss Marple, her needles clicking, spoke softly. "She's frightened," she said as if to herself. "In my village, fear made people clumsy. A girl once hid a theft, but her lies tripped her up." She smiled at Dubois, who grunted, unconvinced but intrigued. As the household retired, Miss Marple lingered by her window, the sea a dark whisper below. Miss Vane's past, she thought, was the shadow behind the drowning, a shadow of guilt or desperation. The will, the hat, the silent fall, these were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Vane's lies were the frame. In St. Mary Mead, a hidden past had always led to a present crime. Here she would follow the shadow, step by quiet step, until it led her to the truth. Chapter 7. The Body That Wasn't the Villa. Aurora, bathed in the golden light of a St. Antoine morning, stood as a silent witness to the week-long shadow cast by Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's drowning. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar wicker chair on the veranda, adjusted her lavender shawl against the sea breeze and gazed at the Mediterranean, its waves glinting like scattered jewels. Her knitting, the ever-growing pink scarf for her niece, lay idle in her lap, her hands still as her mind worked. 7 days had passed, and the absence of Mrs. Hartley's body, coupled with the torn hat, the missing will, and Miss Clara Vane's dubious past, had woven a web of suspicion that Miss Marple was determined to untangle. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that truth, like a buried root, required patience to unearth, and here she sensed it lay close to the surface. The villa's occupants moved through their days with a strained civility. Miss Vane, her sharp features etched with tension, had grown more elusive, her interactions brief, and her eyes ever watchful. Dr. Richard Lloyd, his scientific demeanour unshaken, spent hours in his study, ostensibly reviewing coastal charts, though Miss Marple suspected he was avoiding scrutiny. His wife, Margaret, was a fragile wisp, her nervous tics, bitten nails, twisted shawls, more pronounced, as if she carried a secret too heavy to bear. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose blunt observations had stirred the household, remained a lively presence, her gossip a tool Miss Marple wielded with care. Inspector Henri Dubois, though tireless, was visibly exasperated. His daily reports of the Coast Guard's fruitless searches met with growing scepticism. Miss Marple's thoughts, as delicate and precise as her needlework, turned to the sea. The lack of a body was no mere quirk of currents. It was a clue, as bold as a misplaced footprint in her village's muddy lanes. In St. Mary Mead, a missing corpse had once pointed to a staged death, the victim alive and hidden while a substitute took her place. Here, the idea nagged at her. Mrs. Hartley, robust and practical, was not a woman to vanish without trace, unless someone ensured she did. The torn hat, Miss Vane's vague past, the missing will, all suggested a plan, and the sea, Miss Marple thought, was less a murderer than an accomplice. Her morning was spent in quiet observation, her knitting a pretext for lingering on the veranda. She noted Dr. Lloyd's brisk exit to the village, his satchel slung over his shoulder, and Mrs. Lloyd's furtive glances from the drawing-room window, as if watching for his return. Miss Vane appeared only briefly, fetching a glass of water, her movements swift and silent. Mrs. Bantry, joining Miss Marple for tea, remarked on the companion's odd behaviour. "She's packing Evelyn's things already," she said, her voice low. "Clothes, books, even jewellery. Seems in a hurry to clear her out, don't you think?" Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm. "How curious," she said, her tone mild. "In my village, a maid once sorted her mistress's belongings too soon. Turned out she'd stolen a brooch. Grief takes time, doesn't it?" Her eyes twinkled, but her mind was sharp. Packing suggested certainty, as if Miss Vane knew Mrs. Hartley would not return. In St. Mary Mead, premature actions had often betrayed intent. Here, Miss Vane's haste was a thread to pull. The spark of insight came during a solitary walk along the cliff path, where Miss Marple, leaning on her stick, traced the coastline with her eyes. The cove where the drowning occurred was visible, a crescent of sand hemmed by jagged rocks, its waters deceptively calm. She paused, picturing the boat, the sudden gust, the silent fall. Something about the cove nagged at her, a memory of a village pond where a body, expected to sink, had floated instead. Bodies, she knew, surfaced unless weighted, and the Mediterranean, warm and buoyant, was unlikely to hold a corpse for long, unless, she thought, there was no body to begin with, or the wrong one. She recalled a detail from Dubois' reports. The cove's seclusion, its rocks shielding it from view. A perfect place, she mused, to hide a truth. In St. Mary Mead, A.D.A., Barn had once concealed a runaway, his death staged to deflect pursuit. Here, the cove might hold a similar secret, not a body, but a deception. She resolved to share her suspicion with Dubois, knowing his scepticism would yield to her quiet persistence. The opportunity came that afternoon, when Dubois arrived, his moustache drooping with fatigue. He joined Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry in the drawing-room, where Marie had set out a tray of lemonade. The others were absent, Miss Vane upstairs, the Lloyds in the garden, and Miss Marple seized the moment. "Inspector," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze, "I've been thinking about that cove. It's so hidden, isn't it? In my village, we had a stream where things were misplaced, you might say. Might the Coast Guard look there closely?" Dubois, sipping his lemonade, raised an eyebrow. "The cove? We've searched it, mademoiselle. Nothing but rocks and seaweed." His tone was dismissive, but Miss Marple's smile, so disarming in its innocence, held him. "Of course," she said, nodding. "But in my village, a lost ring turned up in a place we'd searched twice. A body, if it's there, might be tucked away. Behind a rock, perhaps." She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly, and added, "Or it might not be the body we expect." Dubois blinked, caught by the hint of something deeper. "Not expect?" he echoed, leaning forward. "You think—" "What, mademoiselle? That Madame Hartley is not dead?" His voice was sceptical, but his eyes were sharp, and Miss Marple saw she had planted a seed. Mrs. Bantry, ever quick, chimed in. "Jane's got a nose for these things, Inspector. If she says check the cove, I'd wager there's something to find. Evelyn wasn't the sort to just vanish, was she?" Her tone was breezy, but her glance at Miss Marple was knowing. Dubois, after a moment's thought, nodded. "Very well," he said. "I will order a thorough search. Divers, boats, the lot. But I warn you, the sea keeps its secrets." He rose, his notebook in hand, and departed, leaving Miss Marple to her knitting and her thoughts. The search was organised by evening, and Miss Marple, claiming a need for air, watched from the cliff as boats gathered at the cove, their lights bobbing in the dusk. She thought of the boat party, Miss Vane's failed rescue, Dr. Lloyd's currants, Mrs. Lloyd's silence, and wondered what the cove might reveal. A body, she suspected, would not be Mrs. Hartley's, but another placed to deceive. In St. Mary Mead, a staged accident had used a vagrant's corpse to mask a murder. Here, the possibility felt chillingly real. The household dined in near silence, the tension palpable. Miss Vane, appearing for the first time that day, picked at her fish, her eyes fixed on her plate. Dr. Lloyd, discussing the weather with forced cheer, avoided the topic of the search, while Mrs. Lloyd, her hands trembling, spilled her wine, a red stain spreading on the cloth. Mrs. Bantry, sensing the mood, kept the conversation light, but Miss Marple, eating quietly, watched them all. Miss Vane's stillness, she thought, was that of a cornered animal, and Mrs. Lloyd's nerves suggested knowledge or dread. The bombshell came the next morning, when Dubois returned, his face a mix of triumph and confusion. He gathered the household in the drawing-room, his boots leaving faint sand on the rug. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, noted his excitement, a rare crack in his professional veneer. "Mesdames, messieurs," he began, his voice resonant, "the cove has spoken. We found a body, female, dressed in Madame Hartley's clothes, but it is not her." A gasp rippled through the room. Miss Vane's cup clattered to the floor, her face ashen. Dr. Lloyd's spectacles slipped, his hand frozen mid-gesture. Mrs. Lloyd let out a small cry, her shawl falling from her shoulders. Mrs. Bantry, wide-eyed, turned to Miss Marple, who merely knitted, her expression serene but her mind alight. Dubois continued, his moustache twitching. "The body is damaged, bloated by the sea, but the build is wrong. Slighter, the hair darker. We cannot identify her yet, but she wore Madame Hartley's dress, her shoes. How is this possible?" His question hung, a challenge to the room. Tch! Marple's needles paused. She thought of a village ruse, where a stolen dress had disguised a thief's escape. Here the implications were stark. Mrs. Hartley was likely alive. Her death, staged, and another woman dead, had taken her place. The torn hat, the missing will, Miss Vane's lies, all pointed to a plot, and the cove's secret confirmed it. She recalled Miss Vane's haste in packing, her vague past, and saw a woman desperate to erase her employer and herself. Dr. Lloyd, recovering, spoke first. "This is extraordinary," he said, his voice strained. "Could it be a mistake? A local woman, perhaps, caught in the same current?" His suggestion was weak, and Miss Marple saw the sweat on his brow, a sign of unease she'd not seen before. Miss Vane, her voice barely audible, murmured, "It's impossible. I saw her fall." Her hands clasped in her lap were white-knuckled, and Miss Marple noted the lie in her eyes, as clear as a village girl's when caught with stolen jam. Mrs. Lloyd, trembling, said nothing, her gaze fixed on her husband as if seeking a script. Mrs. Bantry, ever bold, broke the silence. "Well, this changes everything. If that's not Evelyn, where is she? And who's this poor soul?" Her question, blunt and practical, echoed Miss Marple's thoughts. Dubois, pacing, promised further investigation, autopsies, inquiries. But his confusion was evident. As he left to coordinate with the Coast Guard, Miss Marple remained, her knitting a steady rhythm. The body, she thought, was the key. A substitute, perhaps a vagrant, a stranger, dressed to deceive, suggested a plan both bold and desperate. Miss Vane, with her access to Mrs. Hartley's wardrobe and her hidden past, was the likely architect. But Dr. Lloyd's discomfort and Mrs. Lloyd's fear hinted at complicity, or at least knowledge. She recalled a snatch of conversation from days ago, when Mrs. Hartley had spoken of a charity she supported, aiding lost souls in coastal towns. Had one such soul become a pawn in a deadly game? In St. Mary Mead, a beggar's death had once masked a richer man's escape. Here, the pattern felt eerily familiar. The will, she suspected, had been the trigger, its new terms threatening Miss Vane's hopes or exposing her secrets. As the household dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her mind weaving the threads. The Cove's body, Miss Vane's packing, Dr. Lloyd's sweat, Mrs. Lloyd's silence. Each was a clue, a stitch in a pattern she was beginning to see. The sea, she thought, had not lied. It had merely delayed the truth. In St. Mary Mead, truth had always found a way, like water through a sieve. Here, in the Villa Aurora, she would guide it to the surface with the quiet persistence of a woman who knew the power of watching, waiting, and asking the right question at the right time. Chapter 8. The Cove's Secret. The Villa Aurora, its white walls glowing under the relentless sun of St. Antoine, stood as a quiet sentinel over the Mediterranean. Its beauty a stark contrast to the turmoil within. Miss Jane Marple, seated on the veranda in her familiar wicker chair, adjusted her shawl against a breeze that carried the faint scent of pine and salt. Her knitting, the pale pink scarf for her niece, lay in her lap, its needles still as she gazed at the sea, its surface a glittering expanse that hid as much as it revealed. 8 days had passed since Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's supposed drowning, and the discovery in the cove, a body not hers, dressed in her clothes, had shattered the villa's fragile calm. Miss Marple, her mind as sharp as the cliffs below, felt the truth drawing nearer, like a tide turning. In St. Mary Mead, she had unravelled deceptions by following the smallest clues. A glance, a lie, a misplaced object. And here, the Cove's secret was a beacon, illuminating a path she was determined to tread. The household was a study in unease. Miss Clara Vane, the companion, had retreated further, her sharp features gaunt, her eyes darting like those of a hunted creature. Dr. Richard Lloyd, his scientific composure fraying, avoided the drawing-room, his steps quick and purposeful as he moved between study and terrace. His wife, Margaret, was a shadow of herself, her nervous tics, twisted shawls, bitten nails, now accompanied by a pallor that spoke of sleepless nights. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever the catalyst, stirred the tension with her blunt observations, her presence a spark in a room primed to ignite. Inspecteur Henri Dubois, invigorated by the Cove's find, was a whirlwind of activity. his visits marked by sharp questions and a newfound respect for Miss Marple's quiet insights. Miss Marple's thoughts, as delicate as her needlework, turned to the body. A woman, slighter than Mrs. Hartley, with darker hair, dressed in the widow's clothes. Her dress, her shoes, her identity. The audacity of the deception was breathtaking, yet it fit a pattern Miss Marple had seen before. In St. Mary Mead, a stolen coat had once masked a thief's flight. Here, a stolen identity suggested a deeper crime. The torn hat, the missing will, Miss Vane's dubious past, all pointed to a staged drowning, with Mrs. Hartley alive, perhaps hidden, and another woman dead to take her place. The question was not only who, but why. Motive, Miss Marple knew, was the heart of any crime, and Miss Vane, with her access and her secrets, was its likely pulse. The morning passed in a hush, the villa's occupants avoiding one another. Miss Marple, knitting on the veranda, noted Dr. Lloyd's absence. He'd left for the village, ostensibly to post letters, and Mrs. Lloyd's furtive pacing in the garden, her eyes fixed on the path he'd taken. Miss Vane emerged briefly, her face a mask of control, to collect a tray of tea, her movements swift as if to evade scrutiny. Mrs. Bantry, joining Miss Marple, remarked on the companion's behaviour. "She's like a ghost, Jane," she said, her voice low. "I caught her sorting Evelyn's papers last night. Letters, bills, all in neat piles. It's as if she's erasing her. What do you make of it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "People act when they're afraid, Dolly," she said, her tone mild. "In my village, a girl once burned a diary to hide her shame. Miss Vane's tidying feels purposeful, don't you think?" Her eyes twinkled, but her mind was sharp. Sorting papers suggested a search, or a purge. Had Miss Vane found the missing will, or something else? In St. Mary Mead, a hidden letter had once revealed a blackmailer. Here, Miss Vane's actions hinted at a secret she could not let surface. The Cove's discovery had shifted the case, and Miss Marple, replaying Dubois' report, pieced together a theory. The body, unidentified, was likely a stranger, a vagrant perhaps, or a woman from the margins, chosen for her anonymity. Mrs. Hartley's clothes, so carefully applied, suggested premeditation, and the Cove's seclusion was the perfect stage. Miss Marple recalled a conversation with Mrs. Hartley about her charity work, aiding lost souls in coastal towns. Had one such soul been exploited, her death a prop in a deadly charade? The idea was grim, but not implausible. In her village, a beggar's disappearance had once masked a richer man's crime. Here, the pattern felt chillingly apt. Her chance to test her theory came at noon, when Dubois arrived, his face alight with purpose. He gathered Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, and the Lloyds in the drawing-room, where Marie had set out a tray of coffee. Miss Vane, summoned, sat apart, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. Dubois, pacing before the fireplace, began with a flourish. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, his moustache twitching, "the Cove has given us truth. The shaken body is not Madame Hartley's. The woman, unknown, perhaps 30, thinner, dark-haired, was dead before the sea took her. A blow to the head, the doctor says, not drowning. And yet she wore Madame Hartley's dress, her shoes. This is no accident." A silence fell, heavy as fog. Mrs. Lloyd gasped. her hand flying to her mouth, while Dr. Lloyd's face tightened, his spectacles glinting as he adjusted them. Miss Vane's breath hitched, a sound so faint it might have been the wind, but Miss Marple caught it, along with the tremor in her hands. Mrs. Bantry, ever bold, broke the quiet. "Good heavens, Henri! You're saying someone killed this woman and dressed her up as Evelyn? Where's Evelyn, then? And who's the poor creature?" Dubois, relishing the drama, nodded. "Exactement, Madame Bantry. We search for Madame Hartley. Alive, we hope. The dead woman we investigate. No papers, no name, but her clothes, ragged beneath the dress, suggest a vagrant, a wanderer. The cove hid her, but not well enough." He turned to Miss Vane, his eyes narrowing. "Mademoiselle, you were closest to Madame Hartley. Her clothes, how did they come to this stranger?" Miss Vane's voice was a whisper. "I don't know," she said, her eyes still on the floor. "Evelyn's things were in her room. I never touched them." Her denial was swift, but Miss Marple saw the lie in her posture, the rigid shoulders, the clenched fists. In St. Mary Mead, a liar's body had always spoken louder than their words, and Miss Vane's was shouting. Dr. Lloyd, clearing his throat, ventured a theory. Could it be a coincidence? A thief, perhaps, stealing clothes and caught in the sea? His voice was steady, but Miss Marple noted the sweat on his brow, a crack in his usual calm. Mrs. Lloyd, silent, stared at her husband, her eyes wide, with what might have been fear or accusation. Dubois scoffed. "A thief, doctor? In Madame Hartley's dress, her shoes, in the very cove where she drowned? Num! This is deliberate." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. "Someone here knows more. I will find out." Miss Marple, her knitting a soft rhythm, spoke gently. "It's so puzzling, isn't it? In my village, a stolen shawl once led to a murder. Clothes can tell such stories, Inspecteur. That dress, might it have been taken from the villa?" Her question, innocent as a child's, hung in the air, and she watched Miss Vane's reaction, a slight flinch, quickly masked. Dubois, intrigued, nodded. "We check the villa's wardrobe. If clothes are missing, we trace them." He turned to Miss Vane. "You packed Madame Hartley's things? Oui, you would know." His tone was sharp, and Miss Vane's face paled further. I only sorted what was there," she stammered. "I didn't notice anything gone." Her voice broke, and she stood, murmuring an excuse about a headache. Dubois let her go, but his eyes followed her, a hunter sensing weakness. As the group dispersed, Miss Marple lingered, her mind weaving a pattern. The body was no accident. It was a substitute, killed and dressed to deceive. Mrs. Hartley, she suspected, was alive, perhaps drugged or coerced, hidden somewhere nearby. The cove chosen for its seclusion had been the stage, and Miss Vane, with her access to clothes and her haste to pack, was the likely director. But Dr. Lloyd's unease, his weak theories, suggested he knew more than he admitted, and Mrs. Lloyd's fear hinted at a secret she dared not voice. In St. Mary Mead, a staged death had unravelled when a witness cracked. Here, the cracks were forming. Her theory solidified during a quiet moment on the veranda, where Mrs. Lloyd, seeking solitude, found Miss Marple instead. The younger woman, her shawl slipping, sat beside her, her hands twisting. "It's awful," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "That body. It's not Evelyn. Clara, She's different now, so cold. She's packing everything, as if Evelyn's never coming back. Her eyes, red-rimmed, met Miss Marple's, and for a moment fear broke through her reserve. Miss Marple, her voice as soothing as a lullaby, nodded. "It's a shock, my dear. People cope in strange ways. In my village, a woman once cleaned her sister's house the day she died. Grief, or something else." She paused, her eyes gentle but probing. "You were on the boat, weren't you? Did you see anything odd?" Mrs. Lloyd's breath caught, and she looked away, her fingers digging into her shawl. "It was so fast," she said, her voice trembling. "Evelyn fell. Clara reached. I didn't see." The lie was clumsy, and Miss Marple saw the truth in her eyes. A flash of something witnessed, something unsaid. In her village, a nervous witness had once revealed a crime, by what she wouldn't say. Here, Mrs. Lloyd was teetering. Miss Marple let the moment pass, resuming her knitting. "Of course," she said, her tone all sympathy. "It's hard to recall such moments. But truth has a way of surfacing, like a cork in water." She smiled, and Mrs. Lloyd, murmuring an excuse, fled, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. Evening, Dubois returned with a new detail. The dead woman's clothes beneath Mrs. Hartley's dress bore a mended tear, suggesting a life of poverty. "A vagrant," he said, joining Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry for sherry. "Perhaps from the port, where such women beg. But how she came to the cove, in those clothes." He trailed off, his frustration clear. Miss Marple, sipping her sherry, ventured a thought. "In my village, a beggar once vanished, and we found her shawl in a barn. Might someone have used this woman, Inspecteur? Her death, her clothes. It feels arranged." Her tone was guileless, but her eyes were sharp, and Dubois, catching her drift, nodded slowly. "You see much, mademoiselle," he said, his voice grudgingly respectful. "I will check the port, ask of missing women. If this was a plan, we find the planner." He left, his notebook bulging, and Miss Marple turned to her knitting, her mind alight. The cove's secret, she thought, was a staged death, with Miss Vane at its heart. The companion's past, her packing, her lies, all pointed to a woman desperate to escape or to claim what wasn't hers. The will, likely destroyed, had threatened her plans, and Mrs. Hartley, alive, was a risk. The dead woman, a pawn, had been the deception's cornerstone, but the sea had betrayed the plot. Dr. Lloyd's unease, Mrs. Lloyd's fear, they were threads too, perhaps accomplices, perhaps witnesses. In St. Mary Mead, a staged crime had unravelled when the guilty panicked. Here, Miss Marple sensed panic rising. As night fell, the villa quieted, the sea a dark murmur below. Miss Marple, by her window, knitted steadily, her needles crafting a scarf and a plan. "Deceptions," she murmured, "are fragile things. In the Villa Aurora, she would wait, watch, and let the fragile break, revealing the hands that built it, one quiet stitch at a time." Chapter 9. The Trap. The Villa. Aurora, its white walls aglow under the fierce midday sun of St. Antoine, stood as a silent stage for the unfolding drama within. Miss Jane Marple, ensconced in her wicker chair on the veranda, drew her shawl closer against a breeze that whispered of the sea's restless secrets. Her knitting, the pale pink scarf for her niece, lay in her lap, its needles quiet as she gazed at the Mediterranean, its waves a glittering veil over truths now rising to the surface. 9 days had passed since Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's supposed drowning and the cove's grim revelation. A body not hers, dressed in her clothes, killed by a blow, had turned suspicion into certainty. Miss Marple, her mind as precise as her needlework, felt the threads of deceit tightening around the guilty. In St. Mary Mead, she had trapped liars with patience and a well-placed word. Here, she would do the same. The household was a cauldron of nerves. Miss Clara Vane, the companion, had become a wraith, her gaunt face and furtive glances betraying a fear she could no longer mask. Dr. Richard Lloyd, his scientific calm unravelling, moved with a stiffness that suggested he sensed the noose. His wife, Margaret, was a trembling shadow, her bitten nails and haunted eyes speaking of a burden too heavy to bear. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her blunt cheer a stark contrast, stirred the tension with her pointed remarks, her presence a goad to the guilty. Inspector Henri Dubois, energized by the cove's evidence, was a bloodhound on the scent, his questions sharper, his patience thinner. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, watched them all, her mild eyes catching every falter, every lie. Her theory, honed by days of observation, was clear. Mrs. Hartley's drowning was a fiction, staged to conceal her survival and the murder of another. A vagrant likely, dressed to deceive. The torn hat, the missing will, Miss Vane's fabricated past, all pointed to the companion as the architect, driven by greed or fear of exposure. The will, Miss Marple suspected, had altered Miss Vane's prospects, prompting a desperate act. Mrs. Hartley, alive, was hidden, drugged perhaps or coerced, while the dead woman, a pawn, had sealed the illusion. Dr. Lloyd's unease and Mrs. Lloyd's terror suggested they knew more, perhaps as witnesses, perhaps as accomplices. In St. Mary Mead, a staged theft had unravelled when the guilty tripped over their own lies. Here, Miss Marple would set a trap to hasten the fall. The morning offered a chance to act. Miss Marple, sipping tea with Mrs. Bantry, shared her plan in hushed tones. "Dolly," she said, her voice soft as a summer breeze, "we need a gathering, everyone together. A hint of new evidence, something to shake them. In my village, a rumour of a found letter once flushed out a thief. Fear makes people careless." Her eyes twinkled, but her mind was a steel trap, ready to spring. Mrs. Bantry, her face alight with mischief, nodded. "I'll talk to Henri. A meeting, official-like, with a bit of theatre. Clara's jumpy as a cat. She'll crack, mark my words." She bustled off to find Dubois, leaving Miss Marple to her knitting and her calculations. The trap, she knew, must be subtle. A suggestion, not an accusation, to let the guilty betray themselves. Miss Vane, with her trembling hands, was the weakest link, but Dr. Lloyd's sweat and Mrs. Lloyd's silence were threads she could not ignore. By afternoon, Dubois agreed, his moustache twitching with anticipation. He arranged a meeting in the drawing room at 5 o'clock, summoning the household with a note that promised new developments in the Hartley case. Miss Marple, invited to attend, prepared carefully, choosing a lavender dress and her most unassuming smile. She thought of a village poacher, caught when a neighbour's casual remark undid his alibi. Here she would play the neighbour, her words a net. The drawing-room, with its tall windows and sea views, was a stage set for tension. Marie had laid out a tray of sherry, its crystal glasses catching the late sunlight. Miss Vane arrived first, her dark hair pulled tightly back, her face a mask of control that cracked at the edges. Her hands, clasped, trembled faintly. Dr. Lloyd followed, his spectacles glinting, his movements stiff as he took a chair by the fireplace. Mrs. Lloyd, clutching a shawl, sat close to him, her eyes darting to the door. Mrs. Bantry, vibrant in a tweed skirt, hovered near Miss Marple, her presence a spark in the charged air. Dubois, standing by the mantel, exuded authority, his notebook open, his gaze sweeping the room. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, watched them settle, her needles clicking softly. She noted Miss Vane's rigid posture, Dr. Lloyd's clenched jaw, Mrs. Lloyd's bitten lip. Each was a tell, as clear as a village gossip's slip. In St. Mary Mead, she had learned that fear was a spotlight, revealing what calm concealed, and here fear was palpable. Dubois began, his voice resonant. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, "we have progress. The body in the cove, not Madame Hartley, but a stranger, murdered and dressed to deceive. This is no accident, but a plan. We trace the dead woman, a vagrant perhaps, from the port, and we find discrepancies." He paused, his eyes on Miss Vane, who stared at her hands, her breath shallow. Dr. Lloyd shifted, his voice measured. "Discrepancies, Inspector. Surely the sea could explain much. Clothes washed ashore, a mix-up." His tone was calm, but Miss Marple saw the sweat on his brow, a sheen that betrayed his nerves. Dubois scoffed. "A mix-up, Docteur. Madame, Hartley's dress, her shoes, on a murdered woman? Non, this is deliberate. Someone here knows how this happened." His gaze swept the room, lingering on Miss Vane, whose fingers tightened, her knuckles white. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, spoke softly, her voice a gentle hum. "It's so strange, isn't it? In my village, a stolen dress once hid a runaway. To dress someone else in Mrs. Hartley's clothes, it's almost like a play, with costumes and all. But who chose the costume, I wonder?" Her question, innocent, as a child's, hung in the air, and she watched Miss Vane's reaction. A flinch, a quick glance at the door. Mrs. Lloyd, her voice trembling, murmured, "It's horrible! Poor Evelyn! And this woman, whoever she was." Her eyes, wide with fear, flicked to her husband, and Miss Marple saw a plea in them, as if begging him to speak or stay silent. Dubois, seizing the moment, pressed Miss Vane. "Mademoiselle, you packed Madame Hartley's things, her clothes, her papers. Did you notice a dress missing? Or perhaps you took one?" His question was a dart, and Miss Vane's composure cracked, her hands shaking visibly. "I took nothing," she said, her voice rising. "I only sorted what was there. Evelyn's things, I was helping, that's all." Her denial was fierce, but Miss Marple saw the lie in her eyes, as clear as a village girl's when caught with a stolen pie. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, chimed in, "Helping, Clara. You've been awfully quick to clear Evelyn out. I'd have thought you'd wait. What with no body? Well, not hers, anyway." Her tone was blunt, and Miss Vane's face drained of colour, her breath a sharp gasp. Miss Marple, her knitting resuming, spoke again, her voice a soothing contrast. "The companion's role is trust, isn't it? so close to someone, knowing their habits, their secrets. In my village, a companion once betrayed that trust. Oh, a sad story, but she faked a death to escape her past. It's curious how life repeats itself." She smiled, her eyes on Miss Vane, who stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "I'm not well," Miss Vane said, her voice hoarse. "I need to lie down." She moved toward the door, but Dubois, with a swift step, blocked her path. "One moment, mademoiselle," he said, his tone firm. "We search your room. If you hide nothing, you have no fear." His words were a challenge, and Miss Vane's eyes widened, a flicker of panic breaking through her mask. The search, conducted with Marie's reluctant assistance, was swift and damning. In Miss Vane's room, hidden beneath a folded shawl in her trunk, Dubois found a letter, addressed to a London bank requesting a transfer of funds in Mrs. Hartley's name, signed with a forged signature. The room fell silent, the letter a guillotine blade. Miss Vane, trembling, sank into a chair, her hands covering her face. "It's not what it seems," she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple saw the trap had sprung. In St. Mary Mead, a forged cheque had once undone a swindler. Here, the letter was Miss Vane's unravelling. Dubois, holding the letter, pressed her. "Explain, mademoiselle. This is fraud, or worse. Where is Madame Hartley? What have you done?" His voice was a whip, and Miss Vane's shoulders shook, her control collapsing. Miss Marple, her knitting steady, watched the scene unfold, her mind piecing together the final threads. The letter confirmed her theory. Miss Vane had planned to steal Mrs. Hartley's identity, or at least her wealth, using the staged drowning as cover. The vagrant's body, dressed to deceive, had been the deception's heart. But the sea's betrayal, the body's early surfacing, had undone the plan. Mrs. Hartley, Miss Marple suspected, was alive, hidden nearby, perhaps in a rented room or a secluded cottage. Dr. Lloyd's unease, Mrs. Lloyd's fear, they were witnesses, perhaps coerced, perhaps complicit. Mrs. Bantry, her eyes wide, whispered to Miss Marple, "You've done it, Jane. She's caught, isn't she?" Miss Marple, her smile faint, nodded, but her mind was on the next step. The letter was a start, but Mrs. Hartley's whereabouts were the key. In her village, a runaway had been found when a neighbour's gossip led to a barn. Here, she would nudge Dubois to search the coast. As Dubois escorted Miss Vane to the station for questioning, Miss Marple spoke softly to him. "Inspecteur, in my village, a missing woman was found in a cottage, hidden by a friend. Might you check the nearby villages? Mrs. Hartley, I think, is not far." Her tone was guileless, but her eyes were sharp, and Dubois, nodding, promised to act. The villa, as evening fell, was a hive of whispers, the trap's success a shock to its walls. Miss Marple, by her window, knitted steadily, the sea a dark murmur below. The guilty, she thought, built their own snares, and Miss Vane had stepped into hers. But the truth was not complete. Mrs. Hartley's fate, Dr. Lloyd's role, Mrs. Lloyd's silence remained. In St. Mary Mead, a trap had always led to confession. Here, in the Villa Aurora, she would wait, her needles crafting a scarf and a path to the final truth, one quiet stitch at a time. Chapter 10. The Confession, the Villa Aurora, perched on the cliffs of St. Antoine, shimmered under a morning sky of unyielding blue, its white walls a serene facade, masking the storm of revelations within. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her customary wicker chair on the veranda, drew her lavender shawl closer against a breeze that carried the sharp tang of the Mediterranean. Her knitting, the pale pink scarf for her niece, lay in her lap, its needle still as she gazed at the sea, its waves, a restless mirror of the truth now breaking free. 10 days had passed since Mrs. Evelyn Hartley's staged drowning, and the trap set the previous evening, Miss Clara Vane's exposure through a forged letter, had cracked the case wide open. Miss Marple, her mind as precise as the stitches she crafted, felt the final pieces falling into place. In St. Mary Mead, confessions had always followed fear, like rain after thunder, and here she sensed the deluge was near. The household was a tableau of shattered pretences. Miss Vane, detained at the police station after the discovery of the forged bank letter, had left a void, her absence a silent accusation. Dr. Richard Lloyd, his scientific poise crumbling, moved with the wariness of a man expecting a blow, his spectacles glinting as he avoided eye contact. His wife, Margaret, was a trembling wreck, her nervous tics, bitten nails, twisted shawls, now accompanied by red-rimmed eyes that spoke of sleepless dread. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her blunt energy, undimmed, was a whirlwind of speculation, her gossip a lens through which Miss Marple glimpsed new truths. Inspector Henri Dubois, invigorated by the letter's find, was a force of purpose, his questions now laced with the certainty of closing in. Miss Marple, knitting quietly, watched them all, her mild eyes catching every falter, every crack in their masks. Her theory, refined through days of observation, was now a vivid tapestry. Miss Vane, driven by a hidden past and the threat of a new will, had staged Mrs. Hartley's drowning, substituting a murdered vagrant to deceive the world. Mrs. Hartley, alive, was hidden, likely drugged or coerced, in a nearby village, her survival, a risk Miss Vane had underestimated. The torn hat, the missing will, the cove's body, all were threads in a plot to steal wealth or escape exposure. Dr. Lloyd's unease and Mrs. Lloyd's terror suggested they had seen or suspected the truth, their silence born of fear or complicity. The forged letter, found in Miss Vane's room, was the knot that tied the scheme together, and Miss Marple, with her gentle nudge, had unravelled it. Now she awaited the confession that would lay bare the heart of the crime. The morning was tense, the villa's air thick with anticipation. Miss Marple, sipping tea brought by Marie, noted Dr. Lloyd's absence. He'd left early, claiming a need to consult a colleague, and Mrs. Lloyd's furtive pacing in the drawing-room, her shawl slipping as she muttered to herself. Mrs. Bantry, joining Miss Marple on the veranda, was alight with excitement. "Jane, you've done it," she said, her voice low but vibrant. "Clara's caught, and Henri says she's crumbling. That letter, my word, it's as good as a signed confession. But where's Evelyn? And what about the Lloyds? Margaret? Looks like she's seen a ghost." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, a soft counterpoint to the sea's murmur. "Fear makes ghosts, Dolly," she said, her tone mild. "In my village, a woman once confessed to theft when her lies ran dry. Miss Vane's lies are spent, I think, and Mrs. Lloyd, she knows something, poor thing. As for Mrs. Hartley, she's Close, I'm sure. A quiet search will find her. Her eyes twinkled, but her mind was a steel trap, calculating the next move. The confession, she knew, would come from pressure, not force, and Dubois, with his relentless probing, was the perfect catalyst. The opportunity came at noon, when Dubois returned, his face a mix of triumph and urgency. He gathered the household, minus Miss Vane, in the drawing-room, where sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows on the polished floor. Marie had set out a tray of coffee, its aroma mingling with the tension. Dr. Lloyd, back from his errand, sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly, while Mrs. Lloyd, beside him, clutched her shawl, her eyes fixed on the rug. Mrs. Bantry, vibrant in a floral dress, stood near Miss Marple, who knitted quietly in her corner, her presence as unassuming as a shadow. Dubois, pacing before the fireplace, began with a flourish. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said, his moustache twitching, "we have broken the case. Mademoiselle Vane, under questioning, has confessed. She is not Clara Vane, but Clara Vernon, wanted in England for embezzlement. She planned to steal Madame Hartley's identity and wealth, using a false drowning to cover her tracks." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room, and Miss Marple noted Dr. Lloyd's sharp intake of breath, Mrs. Lloyd's stifled sob. Dubois continued, his voice resonant. "The body in the cove, a vagrant killed by a blow, dressed in Madame Hartley's clothes, was her deception. Vernon lured the woman from the port, promising work, and murdered her to stage the drowning. The torn hat, the forged letter, all part of her plan. But Madame Hartley, she says, is alive, hidden in a cottage near the village of La Roche. So, search now." His words were a thunderclap, and the room erupted in gasps. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, clapped her hands. "My word, Henry, you've got her! And Evelyn's alive? Jane, you were right!" Her voice was jubilant, but Miss Marple, her needles clicking, remained focused, watching Dr. Lloyd's face. Pale, his jaw clenched, and Mrs. Lloyd's, now buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. To Lloyd, his voice strained, spoke first. "This is shocking, Inspector. But surely you don't think we knew? I examined Mrs. Hartley. She was healthy, as I said. I had no reason to suspect—" His words trailed off, and Miss Marple saw the lie in his eyes, as clear as a village boy's when caught with stolen apples. Mrs. Lloyd, her voice breaking, whispered, "Richard, please." Her plea was a crack in the silence, and Miss Marple, her knitting pausing, seized the moment. "It's so hard, isn't it?" she said, her voice as gentle as a lullaby. "To keep a secret, I mean. In my village, a man once knew of a crime, but stayed quiet, fearing scandal. It ate at him, poor soul. Mrs. Lloyd, you were on the boat. You saw something, didn't you?" Her question, soft as a feather, landed like a stone, and Mrs. Lloyd's head snapped up, her eyes wide with terror. I didn't," she stammered, but her hands betrayed her, twisting her shawl into knots. Dr. Lloyd turned to her, his face a mask of warning, but Miss Marple pressed on, her tone all sympathy. "Of course, my dear," she said, "it's frightening seeing something wrong, but truth is a relief, isn't it, like setting down a heavy load?" Her eyes, mild but piercing, held Mrs. Lloyd's, and the younger woman broke, her sobs filling the room. "I saw her push her," Mrs. Lloyd cried, her voice raw. Clara, she pushed Evelyn, not to save her. I was too scared to say. Richard told me to keep quiet, said it would ruin us." Her confession, a floodgate opened, stunned the room, and Dr. Lloyd's face drained of colour, his hands gripping the chair. Dubois, quick as a hawk, turned to Dr. Lloyd. "Doctor, you knew? You protected this crime?" His voice was a whip, and Dr. Lloyd, cornered, slumped, his defiance crumbling. "I suspected," he admitted, his voice hollow. "On the boat, I saw Clara's movement. It wasn't a reach to save. But Margaret was hysterical, and I feared a scandal. My career, our future. I told her to say nothing. His admission, grudging and weak, was a final thread in the tapestry. And Miss Marple, her knitting resuming, felt a quiet satisfaction. In St. Mary Mead, silence had once shielded a thief. Here it had shielded a murderer, but not for long. Dubois, his notebook open, scribbled furiously. "You will testify, both of you," he said, his tone firm. "This is complicity, Doctor." He turned to Miss Marple, a grudging respect in his eyes. "Mademoiselle, you see what I miss. This trap, it was yours, no?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "Oh, hardly, Inspector. I only notice what people do. In my village, fear always spoke loudest. You did the work." Her humility was genuine, but her mind was already on Mrs. Hartley, the final piece. By evening, Dubois' search bore fruit. Mrs. Hartley was found, dazed but alive, in a rented cottage in La Roche, drugged with sedatives Clara Vernon had administered. She was weak, her memory fragmented, but her survival was a triumph, a light in the villa's darkness. She was brought to the villa, where Mrs. Bantry, tearful, embraced her, and Miss Marple, offering a gentle smile, felt a warmth akin to solving a village puzzle. The details emerged in Dubois' final report, shared over sherry as the sun set. Clara Vernon, facing ruin in England for embezzlement, had wormed her way into Mrs. Hartley's life, planning to siphon her wealth. The new will, leaving the estate to a distant cousin, had been the spark. Vernon, expecting a legacy, saw her plans crumble. She staged the drowning, killing a vagrant to play the corpse, and hid Mrs. Hartley, intending to flee with forged funds. The cove's body, surfacing too soon, had been her undoing, and the forged letter her fatal misstep. Dr. Lloyd, suspecting foul play, had silenced his wife to protect his reputation, a choice that now stained his future. Mrs. Hartley, recovering, joined them, her robust spirit dimmed but intact. "Jane," she said, her voice trembling, "you saved me. I trusted Clara. How could I be so blind?" Her gratitude was heartfelt, and Miss Marple, patting her hand, murmured, "People hide their hearts, my dear, but truth finds a way." The household dispersed. Miss Marple lingered on the veranda, the sea a dark whisper below. Her needles moved steadily, crafting the scarf that would warm her niece's winter. The confession, she thought, was the case's heart. Miss Vane's collapse, Mrs. Lloyd's outburst, Dr. Lloyd's grudging truth. In St. Mary Mead, confessions had always closed a crime, like a book's final page. Here, in the Villa Aurora, the page was turned, but the story of human greed, fear, and folly would linger, a lesson woven into her quiet stitches. Chapter 11. The Aftermath. The Villa Aurora, its whitewashed walls softened by the gentle light of a St. Antoine dawn, stood as a tranquil monument to the storm of truths now settled within its halls. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her familiar wicker chair on the veranda, adjusted her lavender shawl against a breeze that carried the mingled scents of rosemary and the sea. Her knitting, the pale pink scarf for her niece, lay in her lap, its needles quiet as she gazed at the Mediterranean, its waves a serene expanse that belied the chaos it had briefly harboured. 11 days had passed since the staged drowning of Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, and the confession of Clara Vernon, unmasked as an embezzler, murderer, and deceiver, had brought the case to a close. Miss Marple, her mind as delicate and unyielding as her needlework, felt the quiet satisfaction of a puzzle solved, though the human cost lingered like a shadow. In St. Mary Mead, resolutions had always carried a bittersweet tang, and here the taste was no different. The villa's atmosphere had shifted, the tension of deceit replaced by a weary relief. Mrs. Hartley, rescued from her drugged captivity in a La Roche cottage, was recovering, her robust spirit bruised but unbroken, her gratitude a constant refrain. Dr. Richard Lloyd and his wife Margaret had departed abruptly, their complicity in silencing the truth a stain that promised legal and social repercussions. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, her role as catalyst fulfilled, remained a vibrant presence, her gossip now tempered by awe at Miss Marple's quiet brilliance. Inspector Henri Dubois, his scepticism transformed into grudging admiration, had tied up the case with Gallic efficiency, his reports a testament to the villa's dark chapter. Miss Marple, knitting in her corner, observed the aftermath, her mild eyes noting the ripples left by truth's emergence. Her thoughts, as precise as her stitches, turned to the human heart. Clara Vernon's confession, her true identity as a fugitive, her murder of a vagrant to stage Mrs. Hartley's death, her plan to steal a fortune, had been a grim unmasking, but not unexpected. In St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple had seen greed twist souls from a shopkeeper's pilfering to a squire's betrayal. Here, Vernon's ambition, sparked by a will that excluded her, had led to a crime as bold as it was desperate. The vagrant's death, the forged letter, the hidden Mrs. Hartley, all were pieces of a scheme undone by the sea's refusal to keep it secret. Dr. Lloyd's silence, born of fear for his reputation, and Mrs. Lloyd's reluctant confession, wrung from terror, were lesser sins, but no less revealing. People, Miss Marple mused, were their own worst enemies, their flaws the architects of their downfall. The morning unfolded with a gentle rhythm, the villa's routines resuming as if to erase the past. Marie, the taciturn maid, served breakfast on the veranda, her movements brisk, but her eyes softer, as if relieved by the return of order. Mrs. Hartley, her cheeks regaining their florid hue, joined Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry, her sapphire earrings glinting as she spoke of her plans to return to Devon. "I'll sell the London flat," she said, her voice firm despite a faint tremor. "Too many memories now, and I'll rewrite that will. Properly this time, with witnesses I trust." Her gratitude to Miss Marple was fervent, her hand reaching to clasp the older woman's. "Jane, you saw what I couldn't. Clara, I thought her a friend." Miss Marple, patting her hand, smiled gently. "Trust is a gift, Evelyn, but it blinds us sometimes. In my village, a vicar's wife once trusted a rogue. Oh, a sad tale, but she learned. You're safe now. And that's what matters." Her tone was soothing, but her mind noted Mrs. Hartley's resilience, a strength that had survived betrayal. In St. Mary Mead, survivors had always rebuilt, and here Mrs. Hartley would do the same. Mrs. Bantry, stirring her coffee, was less restrained. "My word, Evelyn, you're a marvel. Drugged and hidden, and here you are, planning wills. But Jane, how did you know? That cove, that letter, you sniffed it out like a bloodhound." Her eyes sparkled, and Miss Marple chuckled, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Oh, Dolly, I'm no bloodhound," she said, her voice mild. "I only watch people, as I do at home. A lie here, a fear there, they add up, like stitches in a scarf. Clara's hands, Margaret's eyes, they told me more than words." Her humility was genuine, but her mind was already sifting the case's lessons. Greed's allure, fear's silence, truth's persistence. The conversation turned to the Lloyds, whose hasty departure had left whispers in the villa. Mrs. Bantry, ever the gossip, shared a tidbit from Dubois. "Henri says Richard's in trouble, obstructing justice or some such. Margaret's a wreck, poor thing, but she'll testify. They're back in England, facing questions." Her tone was gleeful, but Miss Marple's expression softened. Her thoughts on Mrs. Lloyd's fear. In her village, a frightened wife had once shielded a husband's theft. Her loyalty a chain. Here, Margaret's silence had been her cage, broken only by confession. Mrs. Hartley, frowning, shook her head. "Richard examined me, said I was fit. I trusted him too. Did he know what Clara was doing?" Her question was a wound, and Miss Marple, her needles pausing, answered carefully. "He suspected, I think," she said, her voice gentle. "On the boat he saw Clara's push, but fear of scandal, of ruin, kept him quiet. In my village, a doctor once hid a patient's poisoning, fearing blame. People protect themselves, Evelyn, even at a cost." Her words were kind, but her mind was firm. Dr. Lloyd's silence, though not murder, was a betrayal, its price now due. The afternoon brought Dubois, his moustache bristling with satisfaction. He joined Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, and Mrs. Hartley in the drawing-room, where Marie had set out a tray of lemonade, its glasses sweating in the warmth. The Lloyds' absence and Vernon's detention left the room airy, as if cleansed. Dubois, pacing before the fireplace, shared the case's final details, his voice a blend of pride and relief. "Mesdames," he said, "it is done. Clara Vernon, she faces trial, murder, fraud, forgery. The vagrant we identify, a woman from the port, Marie Lefebvre, missing for weeks. Vernon lured her with promises, killed her, dressed her to deceive. Madame Hartley, drugged with sedatives, was kept in La Roche, her fortune the prize." Mrs. Hartley, her face pale, murmured, "Marie Lefebvre, I gave to charities for women like her. Clara used my kindness against me." Her voice broke, and Miss Marple, her hand gentle on hers, nodded. Her thoughts on the irony of charity twisted into crime. In St. Mary Mead, a donation had once funded a theft. Here, compassion had been a tool. Dubois, undeterred, continued. "The will, we found, burned fragments in Vernon's room, unreadable but proof of her motive. It left all to a cousin, nothing to her. She planned to flee with forged funds, a new name. The sea, it betrayed her. The body surfaced too soon." He paused, his eyes on Miss Marple. "Mademoiselle, your cove, your questions, they led us. Here you are formidable." Miss Marple, sipping her lemonade, chuckled softly. "Oh, Inspector, you flatter me. I only suggested what seemed clear. In my village, a lost glove once solved a burglary. Small things, you see, speak loudly. You and your men did the work." Her humility was disarming, but her mind was alight with the case's elegance. A vagrant's death, a forged letter, a hidden woman, all undone by a body's untimely rise and a companion's trembling hands. Dubois, grinning, offered her a cognac, which she declined with a smile. "Tea suits me, Inspector, but thank you. Truth is my tonic." Her words were light, but her eyes held his, a silent acknowledgment of their partnership. In St. Mary Mead, she had worked with constables, her insights a quiet nudge. Here, Dubois had been her ally, his vigour matching her precision. Mrs. Bantry, unable to resist, pressed for details. "Henri, what of the Lloyds? Richard's not off the hook, is he? And Margaret, she spilled it all, didn't she?" Her curiosity was infectious, and Dubois, settling into a chair, obliged. "The docteur, he faces charges, obstructing justice, perhaps perjury," he said. "His silence protected Vernon, if only for days. Madame Lloyd, she testifies, her confession key. She saw the push, as Mademoiselle Marple suspected. Fear of her husband, of scandal, kept her quiet. His tone was grim, and Miss Marple, her needles clicking, thought of Mrs. Lloyd's haunted eyes, a mirror to a village wife's shame. The conversation turned to Mrs. Hartley's future, her plans for a quieter life. "I'll fund a shelter," she said, her voice resolute. "For women like Marie Lefebvre, no one should be so desperate." Her resolve was a spark, and Miss Marple, smiling, saw in her the strength of survivors she'd known at home. In St. Mary Mead, a widow had rebuilt after betrayal. Here, Mrs. Hartley would rise. As evening fell, the villa settled into a fragile peace, the sea a soft murmur below. Miss Marple, dining alone in her room, reflected on the case's lessons. Greed had driven Vernon, fear had silenced the Lloyds, but truth, relentless as the tide, had prevailed. The cove's body, the forged letter, Mrs. Hartley's survival, all were threads in a pattern she'd traced, not with fanfare, but with the quiet observation of a woman who saw the world in a glance, a gesture, a lie. She thought of St. Antoine's beauty, its cliffs and waves a stage for human folly, much like her village's lanes and cottages. People, she mused, carried their flaws everywhere, greed, fear, deception, but so too their capacity for truth, for redemption. Mrs. Hartley's gratitude, Dubois' respect, even Mrs. Bantry's awe. They were the case's softer notes, a balance to its darkness. Finishing her meal, Miss Marple took up her knitting, her needles moving with purpose. The scarf, nearly complete, was a small act of care, a contrast to the case's cruelty. "Human nature," she murmured, "is a tangled skein." In the Villa Aurora, she had untangled it, not with force, but with the patience of a woman who knew that truth, like a well-knit stitch, held fast when carefully wrought. As the sea whispered below, she packed her thoughts away, her mind already turning to St. Mary Mead, where new tangles, no doubt, awaited her quiet unravelling. Chapter 12. A Letter Home. The train from Saint-Antoine to Calais chugged through the French countryside, its rhythm a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil Miss Jane Marple had left behind at the Villa Aurora. Seated in a cushioned compartment, her lavender shawl draped over her shoulders, she gazed through the window at rolling fields and distant villages, their stone houses glowing in the soft light of an autumn afternoon. Her knitting, the pale pink scarf now complete and tucked into her bag for her niece, was replaced by a small notebook and pen, her hands poised to write. 12 days had passed since the staged drowning of Mrs. Evelyn Hartley, and the unmasking of Clara Vernon's murderous scheme had restored peace to the villa, though its echoes lingered in Miss Marple's mind. In St. Mary Mead, she had always found clarity in reflection, and now, as the train carried her toward home, she would set her thoughts to paper, a letter to Mrs. Dolly Bantry that would weave the case's threads into a final, coherent pattern. The villa's drama, Clara Vernon's confession as a fugitive embezzler, the vagrant's murder, Mrs. Hartley's hidden survival, had been a stark reminder of human frailty, a mirror to the petty crimes of her village. Miss Marple's role, quiet but pivotal, had turned suspicion into truth, not through confrontation, but through the gentle art of observation. The torn hat, the forged letter, the cove's grim find, all had been clues she'd followed, her mind as precise as the stitches she crafted. Mrs. Hartley, now recovering in Devon, had emerged stronger, her trust bruised, but her spirit intact. Dr. Richard Lloyd and his wife Margaret faced justice for their silence, their departure a footnote to the case's resolution. Inspector Henri Dubois, his scepticism turned to respect, had closed the investigation with efficiency, leaving Miss Marple to reflect on the universal patterns of greed, fear, and redemption. As the train swayed, she began her letter, her pen moving with the steady grace of her knitting needles. My dear Dolly, I write to you from the train, bound for Calais, and then home to St. Mary Mead, where my garden and my neighbours await. The Villa Aurora, with its sunlit cliffs and shadowed secrets, feels a world away, though its lessons will stay with me, as all such cases do. You were splendid, my dear, your blunt cheer a spark that lit the truth, and I thank you for your company in that strange, sad affair. I thought you might like to hear my thoughts on it all, now that the dust has settled and Mrs. Hartley is safe. The case, you'll agree, was a tangled one, not unlike the skeins of wool I untangle for my knitting. Clara Vernon, poor desperate Clara, was its heart, a woman whose past drove her to a crime as bold as it was cruel. She came to Mrs. Hartley as a fugitive, her true name Clara Vernon, wanted in England for embezzling from an employer years ago. I suspect she saw in Evelyn's wealth a chance to escape, to build a new life where her sins could not follow. Companions, you know, are privy to so much. Letters, plans, secrets, and Clara, with her sharp mind and sharper ambition, used that trust to weave her plot. In St. Mary Mead, I once knew a governess who stole from her mistress, her theft a small echo of Clara's grander scheme. People, I find, are much the same everywhere, their desires shaped by what they lack. The will was the spark, wasn't it? Evelyn's decision to leave her fortune to a distant cousin, cutting Clara out, must have felt like a betrayal, though I doubt Evelyn meant it so. Clara, expecting a legacy for her years of service, saw her future crumble. I recall her face when you mentioned the will, Dolly. Pale, her hands trembling, as if the ground had shifted beneath her. In my village, a farmer's son once raged over a changed inheritance, his anger leading to a broken fence and worse. Clara's rage was colder, more calculated. She planned to fake Evelyn's death, steal her identity through forged papers, and flee with her wealth. The audacity of it, to kill a vagrant and dress her as Evelyn, was chilling, but not beyond her. The sea, she thought, would hide her crime, as it hid so many others. The vagrant, Marie Lefebvre, was the case's tragedy, a woman forgotten until the cove gave her up. Evelyn's charity, meant to help such souls, became Clara's tool, luring Marie with promises of work, only to end her life with a blow. I think of a beggar in St. Mary Mead, whose death was blamed on drink until a neighbour's tale revealed poison. Marie's ragged clothes, hidden beneath Evelyn's dress, told her story, a life of want, exploited to serve Clara's greed. The cove, so secluded, was the perfect stage, its rocks shielding the truth until your insistence, Dolly, and my nudge sent the divers there. The sea, it seems, is less loyal than criminals' hope. Clara's plan was clever, but flawed, as such plans often are. The torn hat puzzled me at first. Why would a gust tear it so? I suspect Clara yanked it, a pretext for Evelyn's fall, her push disguised as a rescue. In my village, a torn shawl once hid a theft, the tear no accident but a ruse. Clara's haste to pack Evelyn's things, her forged letter to the bank. They were signs of her panic, her need to erase her employer and herself. I saw it in her hands, Dolly, always moving, always hiding, like a girl in St. Mary Mead who lied about a stolen ring. Hands, I find, are truer than words. The Lloyds, poor souls, were the case's shadow, their silence a lesser crime, but no less telling. Richard, with his doctor's pride, saw Clara's push on the boat, I'm sure of it. His examination of Evelyn, so conveniently timed, was likely a check to ensure she could withstand the drugs Clara planned to use. Fear of scandal, his career, his name, kept him quiet, a choice I've seen in my village, where a chemist hid a poisoning to save his shop. Margaret, dear Margaret, was the weaker link, her fear of Richard and her own conscience a torment. Her confession, wrung from terror, was the case's turning point, her tears as true as any I've seen in St. Mary Mead, where a wife once betrayed her husband's theft under a vicar's gentle probe. Evelyn's survival, found drugged in that La Roche cottage, was the case's light, a reminder that truth can heal as well as wound. Her strength to plan a shelter for women like Marie shows a heart unbroken by betrayal. I think of a widow in my village who rebuilt her life after a swindler's deceit. Evelyn will do the same, I'm sure. Henri Dubois, bless him, was a fine partner, his vigour a match for my quiet nudges. He called me formidable, but I'm only an old woman who sees what others miss, as I do at home, where a glance or a pause can solve a mystery. The Villa Aurora, with its beauty and its darkness, was a stage for human nature, no different from St. Mary Mead's lanes or parlours. Greed drove Clara, fear bound the Lloyds, but trust, Evelyn's, Henry's, even yours, Dolly, brought the truth to light. I'm glad for the rest, for the sea's beauty, but gladder for the clarity it gave me. People, I find, carry their flaws and their virtues everywhere, and a companion's loyalty, like a villager's, can mask ambition or shine true. I'll be home soon, tending my roses and my neighbours' tales, ready for the next puzzle life brings. Give my love to Arthur, and do visit St. Mary Mead soon. We'll have tea and talk of less grim things. Yours affectionately, Jane Marple. Miss Marple paused, her pen hovering as she reread her words. The train's sway, a gentle prompt to continue. The letter, she thought, was more than a recounting. It was a distillation of the case's essence, a way to lay its ghosts to rest. She recalled the villa's final days, Mrs. Hartley's tearful farewell, Dubois' parting nod, Mrs. Bantry's promise to write. The sea, glittering beyond the cliffs, had been a constant presence, its waves a reminder of truths that could not stay hidden. In St. Mary Mead, she had always found solace in writing, whether a note to a friend or a list of clues, and here the letter to Dolly was her closure, a final stitch in the case's fabric. She thought of Clara Vernon, now awaiting trial, her sharp features softened by defeat in Dubois' custody. The companion's ambition, so like a village schemer's, had been her undoing, her lies as fragile as spun sugar. The vagrant, Marie Lefebvre, lingered in Miss Marple's mind, a silent victim whose name at least had been restored. Evelyn's charity, twisted into a trap, would now honour such women, a redemption Miss Marple cherished. The Lloyds, facing their reckoning, were a cautionary tale. Silence, she knew, was a choice with its own cost, as a St. Mary Mead shopkeeper had learned when hiding a theft. The train's whistle sounded, pulling Miss Marple from her reverie. She resumed her letter, adding a postscript about her garden, a nod to the ordinary life awaiting her. The case, she reflected, was a mirror to her village where greed and fear played out in smaller ways. A stolen purse, a whispered lie. St. Antoine's grandeur had not changed the human heart. It had only given it a wider stage. Her role, as ever, was to watch, to listen, to nudge. Her quiet presence a catalyst for truth. In St. Mary Mead, her neighbours called her nosy, but they valued her clarity. Here, Dubois' respect had been her reward. As the train neared Calais, Miss Marple sealed the letter, her hands steady despite the journey's jostle. The scarf, packed carefully, was a small triumph, a gift born of patience, much like the case's resolution. She thought of Evelyn, rebuilding in Devon, and of Dolly, no doubt regaling Arthur with the villa's tale. The sea, left behind, was a memory now, its lessons etched in her mind, trust betrayed, truth restored, lives reshaped. Slipping the letter into her bag, Miss Marple leaned back, her eyes on the passing fields. People, she murmured, are their own stories. In the Villa Aurora, she had read one such story, its ending both grim and hopeful. In St. Mary Mead, new stories awaited, their clues hidden in a glance, a word, a pause. She smiled, her mind already turning to her roses, her tea, and the quiet mysteries of home, where her needles, her eyes, and her heart would weave truth from life's endless skein.